So last year, you'll remember I sat down with Michael Ness and had a conversation about Joseph W Musser. Now, I got a lot of great feedback from that episode, so with that in mind, I decided that I wanted to put out more content like this, which dealt with Mormon Fundamentalist history and its prominent players. This time, Michael joins me again as we discuss John W. Taylor. Now, we anticipate that this will be a 2 to 3 part series. On this first installment about John W. Taylor, we cover all the events that led up to John W. Taylor's ministry. Buckle up, because you're about to get a masterclass in the time period around the persecution of those early saints by the United States government, which would ultimately give rise to the Manifesto and the birth of modern Mormon fundamentalism. By the end of this episode, you will have a greater understanding for those persecutions and, in turn, our own history as Mormon fundamentalists. That and more on this edition of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Look, it's no secret that our society has become much more crude and coarse. To become and raise men and women of virtue and character is a Herculean task. To help with this, I have recently wrote and published a book. Now, back in the 1700s, Washington had a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. It was a book with 110 rules that talked about how to conduct yourself like a civilized person in society, something that today's society is sorely lacking. What I did is I went back through the book and I reinterpreted his original sayings for the 21st century. So the book is laid out in a way in which you see Washington's original rule. Right below that is my explanation for the 21st century, and below that you'll find 2 or 3 examples of where to use this in the real world. Now, to go along with this, there's a workbook that helps parents teach these principles and practices to their kids. To find the book, go to MormonRenegade.com, go to the bottom of the page, search out the blog post, and order your copy today. I can bear personal testimony from personal experience that this is an invaluable tool to help you raise men and women of virtue and character. Michael, what's going on?
Not much, just excited to finally get on.
Dude, I'll tell you what, I'm jacked up for this one. I've been teed up for this one all week. So the stuff we did on Musser, and I had somebody who everybody would know their name, a historian, come to me and said, after he listened to the 2 episodes we did on Joseph Musser, say that it may have been to this point, until maybe Christina releases her book, the most definitive work that had been done on Joseph W. Musser to that point. So it was pretty high praise. And I have a feeling that we're about to dive into another man from the same time period who's done so much for preserving the gospel. And that's John W. Taylor.
Yeah, when you asked me about if I knew anyone who could do an episode on Joseph Musser, I never would have thought I would have done an episode on him. And it was just kind of like that when I thought about it. I was like, you know what? I'll give it a swing, right? But it turned out, and you and I both, I think we were both very edified with the discussion of the context that came out throughout that. And that, like I said, it wasn't anything I had intended to do or to focus on, but that was definitely like that feeling got me through the research on this one, because I know it'll be a good payoff, because this one took a while. I don't know when we put out the Musser stuff, but I started looking into this one right after, and it's taken a minute, but it's like you're saying, it's the same time period, but before a little bit. There's a little bit of overlap, and we're going to get into a lot of we're going to talk about more about Joseph Musser. We're going to talk about a lot of people that's not John W. Taylor. And anything that will really be necessary to bring up the context of the world that we're dealing with at this point is going to be brought up.
Nice. Well, dude, let's tear into it. I'm excited.
Yeah, no doubt. So John W. Taylor, that's John Whitaker Taylor, was born on May 15th, 1858, to Sophia Whitaker, who was the fifth wife of President John Taylor. And John W. Taylor was born during the Utah War and in the city of Provo. He was ordained to the apostleship by his father at the age of 25 and was candidly referred to as the prophet of the quorum or the people's apostle. He was very popular. In fact, his son relates that pretty much he was the kind of person that you were lifelong friends with him, or you felt like you were going to be, that you were lifelong friends with John W. Taylor after you met him for like an hour and talked with him for an hour.
Just
You know,
really engaging and sincere. And
mm-hmm. um, but he was called the prophet of the quorum because he very frequently made public and private prophecies, and he was notoriously correct when he,
really,
yeah, when he would go and do that. So he definitely had that gift. Um, bef- before we Before we go into John W., though, I'd like to talk about John Taylor, his father, a little bit. What do you know? Do you have anything interesting on John Taylor?
dude, John Taylor, I don't have any interesting nuggets of information, but just from a personal standpoint, um, the man was absolutely gangster in his stance in protecting the fullness of the gospel, right? I mean,
Oh,
this was
sure.
a guy who was not going to budge. You know, I when I went back east, when I went out to Nauvoo in Missouri last summer, we stopped off in Nauvoo and I got to sit in his house for a few
Cool.
minutes. And dude, he absolutely is one of my heroes, but I have no nuggets of history or information.
Fair enough. All right, I'll tell you a little. I'll tell you what I got off the top of my head. He was a primitivist as far as Christianity goes, at least in his early years, right? And he was born in England.
What's a
Uh,
primitive? Explain what that.
and he was looking for the ancient church and did not. He was one of those who didn't believe that the church, as it was in the days of Christ, was really on the earth. And they were looking. He was among others in America and in England who were looking for something that looked more like biblical Christianity,
Right.
scriptural Christianity without creeds, the creeds that Christianity had. And he moved to Toronto, Canada, because his desire was to go to America and preach the gospel,
Hmm.
as far as he understood it. And he was a carpenter by trade, at least at one point in his life. When he was in Toronto, that was his business for a point. Um, and let's see, he liked to garden. That's what I was thinking of. He liked to garden. Um, he uh, he was attending these meetings, and I wouldn't call it a church. I don't think it was a church per se, but they were or revival type meetings, more like Sunday school
Gotcha.
type meetings, with others that kind of felt similarly when Parley Pete Pratt shows up in Toronto.
Okay.
And I believe he actually knocked doors on the Taylor residence before he was invited to speak there. And it was either John Taylor or his wife turned Parley away.
Really?
And I don't know if it was John or if it was his wife and he wasn't home or what I don't recall. It's been like 7 years since I've read Parley P. Pratt's autobiography where that was mentioned. But in any case, he ends up getting invited by someone else to a meeting where John Taylor and he's there, and watches Parley preach because
Okay.
Parley was invited to preach at that congregation. And I wanted to bring up John Taylor's belief system seeking after primitive or original Christianity, um, shows you he would have been well versed in the Bible.
Right.
Especially, wanting to preach the gospel, you have to be, he knows his stuff. He knows the scriptures. And he was one of the people who went on record as saying, once I read the Book of Mormon, after hearing what Parley taught or the elders taught, I can find no contradiction with the revealed word of God in the Bible. There is no contradiction between Mormonism and what I know to be true.
So he really puts it through the paces, because this is really what it's about for him. I mean, he immigrates from England for the
Yep.
very purpose of trying to preach the gospel and find, quote, the primitive church, the church that resembles most likely that which was established by Jesus.
Yep, absolutely. And so it's almost like it would be too good to be true, right? This is what you've been looking for your whole life, and now it's right in front of you.
Right.
And apostle of Jesus Christ declaring all your hopes and dreams coming true, And so if that was me, I would be a little skeptical,
Sure.
probably, at least with at least a healthy amount of skepticism. In any case, he he converted. He ends up becoming the presiding elder of the branch of the church in Toronto. Um, and I don't know how long it was that he stayed in that leadership position. During that point, because of his involvement with church affairs, his wife started getting a little paranoid that um, they would fail financially because he wasn't working and doing his carpentry stuff. He wasn't
Right.
making and selling furniture and doing the things that he would normally do because he was so focused on church business. And then, right around the time where the Kirtland apostasy happens, um, and the leadership moved to far west Missouri, he's still presiding elder in Toronto, but a man named Samson Avard um, comes up from Kirtland or from Missouri. I think he was in Missouri, and tells John Taylor that you've been relieved um, of your office right here, and Joseph wants you to go to Kirtland. And apparently that's not true. uh,
Oh,
yeah, and I don't know if Samson Avard was to relieve and take his place as the branch president. I don't recall now. But in any case, he was told that that there was a change in the local leadership. And I mean, it's kind of technically true because at this point in time, although I don't think Samson Avard knew it and John Taylor didn't know it, but Joseph Smith had just gotten a revelation, which is in section 118 now, which was calling John Taylor to be an apostle.
okay. Now,
And so
has Joseph and John Taylor met by this point?
yeah, they had met at this point at least once. I believe Joseph had been up to Toronto on a visit, and I don't know how often John Taylor was able to go down to Kirtland at all. It wasn't very often, if at all. In fact, he was not able to attend the solemn assembly in the Kirtland Temple because he was in Canada.
Okay.
So he was not there for that. So he was not called, or if he was called, he couldn't make it. And so he's now relieved of his station, and he goes down to Kirtland basically to find out that the town's apostatized and the
Oh,
and the
boy.
leadership's gone.
Oh, boy.
you know, and I don't know how long they stayed there. He pretty much, if I recall, he sold pretty much all he had, all that he could, and they got their wagons and their, the train going, and they went down to Kirtland, and they found out that the leadership had gone down to Missouri, and so okay, now I guess we're going to Missouri, you know.
Jeez.
And so they had intended to only go to Kirtland, end up traveling to Missouri, and it takes them a while because they have some obstacles and they have to stop along the way at least once for a while. And by the time they get to far west, war has broken out.
Holy cow.
And, you know, uh, his grandson, Samuel Woolley Taylor, says in his book on his grandfather, he basically, as soon as he arrived in far west Heber C. Kimball hands him a rifle. you know.
Dude, think about that. He probably leaves someplace in Toronto that's probably, comfortable for that time period, right?
Mhm.
And it's like telling your wife and your kids, "All right, we're going to Kirtland. That's where the church is. That's where Brother Joseph wants us. We're going to go down there." And then it's on fire, essentially, right? Maybe not
Right.
physically, but it's on fire. There's an apostasy going on.
Right.
And there's a message to go to Missouri after that. And you're like, well, crap. Like, dude, I'm not sure I'd have had that much faith. At that point, I may have been like, we're turning the wagons around. We're going back to Toronto. We'll figure this out from someplace comfortable.
Sure. Sure.
But
Absolutely.
he's like, screw it. Hit those nags. We're moving on to Missouri. And then you get there and it's like, we're so glad to see you. Here's a rifle. Take your position.
Well, and he gets, yeah, and he's told that he was called to be a member of the 12,
Right.
Yeah, at that point. At least I'm pretty sure that's how that story goes. And so they're there. They stay there for a while. There is the Missouri Mormon War. I don't think he was one of those who was taken prisoner, but they get sent on a mission by Revelation. And I don't know if it's also in section 118 or where it is, but the 12 were called to come. They were called to dedicate the temple in Far West, and then to leave on a mission to England. I think it was England, and they, but they get driven out, right?
Right.
And before the dedication, and the mobs are like, "Well, this is one prophecy that won't come true," you know. And so Joseph Smith, Hiram, and Sidney Rigdon, Parley P. Pratt are all in jail. Um, Parley was in Richmond jail, not Liberty. And David Whitmer and W Phelps had apostatized, and Thomas Marsh, the president of the Quorum of the 12, had apostatized at this point, and David W. Patton, who was next in charge of the Quorum of the 12, died.
Okay.
And so that leaves Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball as the head of the church in Far West to evacuate everyone to Commerce, Illinois, while Joseph and the rest are in jail. And then, after getting settled somewhat, Brigham Young leads the 12, including John Taylor, back down to Far West under the cover of night to dedicate the Far West Temple site. And they hold, yeah, commando style, literally in enemy territory, behind enemy lines.
Dude, and then to like, I just imagine those guys looking down right now going, you guys are such wusses.
Oh,
Like,
sure.
complain and piss and moan about having to read your scriptures or pay your tithing. Meanwhile, these dudes are slipping behind enemy lines, throwing arms to the square in the cover of darkness to get that dedication done.
Yep, and they had a whole meeting essentially. They sang a hymn, opened a prayer by prayer, and then they offered the dedicatory prayer. And then after they dedicated the cornerstones, they sat Wilford Woodruff and George A. Smith, I think, on the cornerstones and ordained them apostles to fill up some of the vacancies that were still in the quorum.
Dude, I'll tell you what, this to me is interesting because if we think about organized Mormonism today, and this I'm not saying this is a blanket, but they must have felt empowered from Joseph Smith to be able to get that stuff done, right?
Sure.
These aren't men who are just cowering before a man going, what should I do? What should I do? They somehow feel empowered enough that they're like, Joseph would be cool with this. Let's get this done. And I think it really kind of flies in the face of some of the way Joseph's painted sometimes, that he's kind of a dictator, that everything that happens has his okay. But he seems to really go the other direction. He empowers people to do this sort of stuff.
Yeah, he does. And when correction needs to be made, he makes it. Right.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
But I say, I mean, to me, that's just that will be probably another topic of study for me personally later, into more into that period, the early life of Brigham Young there. But to me, like that's something that we don't talk about with Brigham Young, and that's like the test for him
Mhm.
is everything just went to absolute hell at that point. Joseph, Sidney, Hiram in jail, and a senior member of the 12 is dead, and the most senior president is off signing affidavits that got this whole ball rolling. The Missouri War.
Right.
And then your state president and one of his counselors just got X'd right before all that went down too. And so technically Brigham Young was acting not just as head of the Quorum of the 12, but before Joseph went to jail, Joseph Smith okayed Brigham Young acting as the president of that stake.
Right.
So he was acting as president of the Far West stake at that point as well.
And then you got John Taylor, who's like, he had to have thought at some point, what the hell did I just get in the middle of?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And in any case, so he's fast forward a few years on the 1940 or 1840-41 mission. He goes back to England to preach the gospel. And once he gets back to Nauvoo, Joseph Smith has him working in the Times and Seasons print shop with him
Yep.
as associate editor. And so Joseph Smith and John Taylor, their day-to-day job, I mean, besides the other stuff that Joseph Smith had to do, right? Their day-to-day job was working on the Times and Seasons together.
Man. And those must have been invaluable times to Taylor as well.
Sure.
Right? Because just like anybody else, you talk with your coworkers, you're shoulder to shoulder, you get to know them pretty well. Those must have been just formative years for Taylor.
Oh, absolutely. It's one-on-one time, presumably, with the prophet. Um, I don't know how many hours they were working a day, but you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's killer, honestly. I mean, it's literally a dream come true. And so I trust John Taylor
Yeah.
as um as someone to distribute that knowledge, that light knowledge,
Absolutely.
right? And so another interesting thing that happened in Nauvoo was, are you aware of, and I'm sure you are, in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, where Joseph is giving that priesthood elaboration on the Adam on Diamond
Yeah.
scenario,
Yep.
where the Ancient of Days comes and then the Son of Man comes before him and is crowned and delivers up his keys, and
Yep.
then all the others deliver up their keys and all that.
Yep.
John Taylor wrote that for on behalf of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith asked John Taylor to actually write that down.
Really. So Joseph relays the information and John Taylor puts it into something that is pleasing to read.
Right, and he actually says there's a talk in the Journal of Discourses, and I don't have the reference, but it is in there, where he says it took him more than once to write it down and he admitted, I didn't understand what Joseph was getting at first.
Wow.
It was and I think that's because it ties into the Adam God doctrine, which I would like to talk about too.
Yeah.
I think that was veiled, and I don't think he was just coming out right out and saying that at that point to John Taylor, but he was trying to illustrate that without saying it.
Right. Maybe
You
give
know,
maybe give him enough breadcrumbs, so to speak, that he could start asking the questions and getting some answers on that.
but in any case, in the journals, he says in conference how Joseph had him write that, and even if you go into the words of Joseph Smith, it's the scholars attribute that to John Taylor. Um, but so yeah, on the Adam God doctrine with John Taylor, there's the first reaction, or one of the first reactions I've seen growing up in the church when you bring up the Adam God doctrine is that, well, that was Brigham Young's. Once Brigham Young died, John Taylor sought to kind of re-Christianize the church.
Right.
The first thing he did was publish a book called The Mediation and Atonement. Have you ever read that?
I haven't.
Super good, actually. And people who take that point of view, I think they're wrong, but they say that that's because of that reemphasis on Christ and the atonement. That's just kind of the recalibration um, towards where we're at today, right? I don't know if other Christians would think that after reading that it re-Christianized the church, because that entire book is literally about the atonement being the vehicle to reconcile ourselves with the Godhead and become gods ourselves.
Right.
And it's a great book. It's a fabulous book. But to so I know for a fact that President John Taylor, didn't have an axe to grind against the Adam God doctrine. In fact, I'm fairly certain he believed it. Let's see. So not only did he have that experience where he wrote that down for Joseph, he later writes or tells Brigham Young's secretary, L. John Nuttall. Do you know who L. John Nuttall is?
Yep, I do.
L. John Nuttall was actually a son-in-law of John Taylor. So he had married one of John Taylor's daughters, and was secretary to Brigham Young, secretary to John Taylor later when the first presidency was reconvened, and he was secretary to Wilford Woodruff
Right.
later on. And he wrote down the lecture at the Vale in St. George.
Yep.
From Brigham Young, right? And that's got the Adam God doctrine in it. And he tells Brother Nuttall, I heard the prophet Joseph say that the keys of the priesthood came down to me and Oliver through Peter, James, and John, and they received it from Christ, and he received it from Adam. And Adam is the father of our bodies. Who is to say that he is not also the father of our spirits?
Right.
And so that's in a page in some L. John Nuttall papers dated to 1879, when John Taylor told him that, reminiscing that. Also, I didn't go back and check this, but he might have been at the prayer meeting. See if I can check it real quick. In March of 1852, right before Brigham Young gives the April 9th, 1852 General Conference talk, where he launched out on that,
Right.
there was actually a prayer meeting where some of the 12 were there, and Brigham Young gives the Adam God doctrine in a revelation type format. Have you ever seen that?
I haven't. Is this in the Journal of Discourses?
It is not. It's the only place I've ever seen it published is in Drew Briney's Understanding Adam God Teachings.
Okay.
And so it was taken in shorthand. I don't recall who the scribe was. I'm just seeing if John Taylor was at that meeting, and I don't think he was. He was not there. I was hoping he would be there. In any case, now that we're there, though, whoever was writes, met in temple rooms and prayed. Orson Pratt was mouth, conversed upon Orson Pratt's discourse in the endowment rooms yesterday. Brigham Young rolled out revelation upon revelation in regard to the creation of the world. Adam came to the earth when he assisted to form it. He partook of the fruits of the earth and became earthly, and they which are after should receive our resurrected bodies and shall have the privilege of going as Adams to form an earth and do likewise.
Ooh.
So that was in a prayer meeting right, in March, right before the April 9th conference. And so
Right.
my personal view on that is that because it was kind of received as the word of the Lord at that point, Brigham Young felt comfortable launching out publicly. Although, if you go through his discourses previous to that, after Joseph Smith dies, you can pick up that he's laying down the insinuation hard
Yep.
already before that. In any case, I was hoping John Taylor was at that meeting. He was not. But in 1860, Orson Pratt gets called in to a disciplinary meeting because he had been sent on a mission somewhere and he was publishing the Seer or some other magazine. And Brigham Young had told him not to publish any articles regarding his thoughts on the Holy Spirit. Are you aware of Orson Pratt's views on the Holy Spirit doctrine as he understood it?
Is it the one, and don't quote me, is it the one where he thinks that the Holy Spirit is kind of all of us together, the mind of God, so sort of a thing?
That's definitely part of it. He, in the Journal of Discourses, when he was giving one of these talks, he basically prefaces it by saying, I don't want to contradict the understanding or the revelation that says that there's three gods in the Godhead. But according to Revelation, because lectures on faith was part of the Doctrine and Covenants at that point,
Yep.
right? According to Revelation, there are two beings in the Godhead that are personages, and the third is the mind and will of God in unity, right? And so so the problem philosophically that you're facing now in Mormonism as a response to the sectarian God that can be everywhere,
Right.
all the time, and all powerful, right? And knows everything is how can God be everywhere if he's now tabernacled and confined to one finite location?
Right.
And so Orson postulated that essentially the Holy Ghost was a spiritual light or fluid that was dispersed throughout the immensity of space and therefore could touch everything. And that came from God, right? Or the all embodied gods in the universe, right? In any case, he published some stuff on that, got in trouble, and he gets called into the meeting, and they're talking about it. And Orson Hyde actually tells Orson Pratt, I think in that meeting, well, I was trying to teach that back in Nauvoo, and Joseph told me that was wrong. you know,
Right.
and in any case, Orson's getting defensive, and he kind of retorts with, well, Brigham gets to teach the Adam God doctrine, which is contrary to Scripture, or whatever,
Okay.
So they get into it, right? At that, and I find John Taylor's response very interesting because he says, when Brother Brigham tells me a thing, I consider it a revelation. Some things are apparently contradictory, but are not really contradictory. He says, according to Scripture, Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection. But if Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection, how is it then that his Father was resurrected before him?
Right.
There must be a discrepancy, and meaning with what is said about the atonement or about the resurrection can be relative to this creation.
Right. Right.
Or to a certain context. Therefore, we know, and he's pointing out that we believe God's a resurrected being, and he couldn't have fathered Christ or created this world without being. And you run into huge paradoxes with the plan of salvation if you suppose that there could not have been a resurrection before Christ's resurrection, because then what happens to every other God in eternity, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That God would cease to be God.
Right. Or you just have spiritual gods, spirit bodies, an infinite number of them hanging out for a time that you can't put a number on because how long is eternity? How far back to go? It makes no sense. And so now in this time, this is the middle. And that we're to come and redeem all the gods. I don't really buy that. And so John Taylor points that out, and he says there must be a discrepancy. If the power of God was sufficient to resurrect the body of Christ, then it was sufficient to resurrect the body of Adam.
Yeah.
And that's what he tells Orson Pratt. after Orson brings up the Adam God doctrine. So that shows me he's a supporter.
Right. He's not only is he well versed in it, but he's well versed in it enough to be able to point out some fallacies on some other things on that. So yeah, and it would make sense, right? I mean, look, if Joseph's trusting him enough to be the guy to print the times and seasons,
Sure.
and he's working alongside him, you can only imagine the conversations that were had in there.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. And he goes on. Um, he doesn't ever teach it publicly that we're aware of. And I'm sure we would be aware of it at this point if he had. But if I recall, Brigham Young in the last years of his life basically said, because this isn't really being accepted by the people, keep it hush hush for a while, or don't teach it. Just don't teach it publicly. And so I think John Taylor kind of took that stance. And most of the time in the Journal of Discourses or wherever, when he's talking about the Father, he calls him by the name of Jehovah, which is also different than the current LDS understanding.
Well,
And
also they probably thought, you know what, if they don't accept this Adam God thing from the pulpit, they got to go through the temple at some point. And
sure,
the
sure.
whole temple drama is really a master class and a tutorial in Adam God doctrine when you get
Sure.
right down to the heart of it.
Yep, it sure is. And in George Q. Cannon's journal in 1882, he writes that he went over to John Taylor's house and he had a discussion with John Taylor on his thoughts on our Father in heaven, Adam.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
So
That's probably a slam dunk.
in private, yeah, in private, he was willing to talk about it. It looks like, or willing, not able, but willing to talk about it. So that's John Taylor. This is stuff that I think we need. It's more than we needed to cover, but I thought it was fun. And we can start. We can start with John W. Taylor. All right, the Utah War. What do you know about it?
I know the government was pissed that we were practicing polygamy. They march an army in. Brigham ends up ordering the covering up of the foundation of the Salt Lake Temple.
Right.
John Taylor then goes, all the church leadership then goes underground or to jail.
So let's see, where do we want to start here? So Brigham Young reactivated the Nauvoo Legion when Johnston's army was coming through Wyoming. And instead of engaging the army directly, Brigham Young and the other leaders of the Nauvoo Legion developed a strategy that would be kind of like guerrilla warfare.
Smart.
Hit and runs, hindering and weakening the approach. Daniel H. Wells, I don't know if he was a member of the first presidency yet. If he wasn't yet, he is going to be very soon at this point. Daniel H. Wells is someone that's super interesting in a priesthood sense because he was ordained an apostle by Brigham Young and taken right into the first presidency as a counselor. And then he was never made a member of the Quorum of the 12 after Brigham Young died.
Interesting.
And he was a general authority still. He was an apostle, and he still met with the Quorum of the 12. But in the meetings, they refer to him as a counselor to the 12 apostles after Brigham Young died.
Interesting.
So yeah, he was an apostle outside the quorum. Just throwing that out there.
You mean that can happen?
Yes. Yes, and he's not the only one, by the way.
Wow, it's too bad I didn't do an interview with a guy who just talked about some of this. Like, I don't know, maybe like Sean Anderson or something. Anyway, yeah.
So Daniel Wells is acting as the head of the Nauvoo Legion, and he instructs Major Joseph Taylor, no relation to John Taylor. He instructs him on ascertaining the locality or route of the troops, proceed at once to annoy them in every possible way. Use every exertion to stampede their animals and set fire to their trains. Burn the whole country before them and on their flanks. Keep them from sleeping by night surprises. Blockade the road by felling trees or destroying the river fords where you can. Watch for opportunities to set fire to the grass on their windward so as possible to envelop their trains. Leave no grass before them that can be burned. Keep your men concealed as much as possible and guard against surprises. Um, Porter Rockwell was there doing a lot of that, by the way.
Guy's a badass.
While that was going on, Brigham Young evacuated Salt Lake City on March 23rd, 1858. And he had a few guys stay behind to put hay and straw in the houses, and they were going to burn that mother down if the army came in.
Ooh.
The whole city, I mean, I don't know how big it was in 1858, but definitely not the same size it is now. But still, can you imagine that? You're just after being done harassed by silent vigilantes in the Wyoming plains, starving and freezing to death, and you get down out of Echo Pass to see just a massive fire burning.
Just the whole place on fire. Uh, dude, I'm thinking about those poor pioneers, right? I mean, they suffered all that crap. They finally get out, like no one's gonna want this place. It's a desert with a really salty lake next to it. And finally thinking you're gonna have some peace. Not yet. Not yet. Now, Brigham's like, hey, get ready to torch your place. If we can't
Yep.
have it, nobody is.
Part of me, dude, if I could have been a time traveling angel or something, I might have like made that happen because I think it would have delayed some problems that we have now. If another generation had to be raised in hardship
Mm-hmm.
and know how to sacrifice to get close to the Lord, and maybe I'm not one to talk because I wasn't there obviously, but I think I could deal with harder than I deal with,
Right.
at least I could deal with Spartan living anyways. Maybe that's not my trial. In any case,
Just
um,
say, wait till you're 45. You'll change your mind.
um, that ended up not having to happen, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. But everyone pretty much evacuated down to Provo, and this is where John W. Taylor is born.
Mm-hmm.
Although before we all right, um, I'll come back to something else I skipped over. But so he was born. I don't know if John Taylor helped recondition the living quarters, but in any case, Sophia Whitaker Taylor, because I mean, when you move however many refugees into the town, there's not going to be a lot of living space for everyone, right? So they kind of, did some spit and polish and makeup on a chicken coop,
Right.
and that's where John W. Taylor was born in a chicken coop in Provo, Utah, during this whole episode. So put a pin in that. I want to go back before this point, as the Johnston's army that was heading from down, they sent a captain ahead of them, Captain Van Vliet, to kind of do some negotiations. And they were kind of, I think they were kind of suing for peace at this point, anyways, because they were getting a lot of trouble, as as was the point. In any case, Captain Van Vliet gets invited to a meeting, and I don't know what kind of meeting it was, but John Taylor's speaking. Okay, and I wanted to read uh, what John Taylor thought about this whole situation.
Okay.
Okay, or actually, this is taken out of Samuel Woolley Taylor's book, um, Kingdom or Nothing, I believe. And so it's got a little bit of his narrative first, but then it'll jump to what John Taylor said. Samuel Woolley Taylor writes, Sunday morning was too hot for the saints to assemble in the adobe tabernacle. They gathered out back at the Bowery, shaded by the canopy of fresh tree branches. As John Taylor arose to speak, every bench was crowded, while the overflow stood about the pole framework. On this September 13th, 1857, the U.S. Army was bivouacked in Wyoming at Hams Fork on the Green River, only 143 miles away, awaiting the order to march on Utah. The saints were gathered for council at this time of crisis. Seated among the brethren on the rostrum was a U.S. Army officer. The audience anticipated that while Taylor would address the congregation, his every word would be directed to Captain Stuart Van Vliet, whose report to his superiors would reflect the Mormon attitude towards the threat of armed invasion. Van Vliet, assistant quartermaster, had been in the Great Salt Lake City several days, vainly trying to secure supplies for the men and livestock of the Utah expedition, 2,500 troops, with as many more teamsters and camp followers, the gamblers, and the prostitutes. So 5,000 people counting, right? Taylor had previously known Captain Van Vliet a decade ago at winter quarters, where the officer had helped the impoverished saints by furnishing employment. So he might have had something to do with the Mormon battalion at that point. But while Van Vliet was regarded with personal cordiality, Brigham and the 12 refused to sell him provisions and lumber for the army of occupation. Taylor began his remarks with a discussion seemingly unrelated to the problem at hand. However, his purpose was to reassure the saints of divine protection and at the same time to put a flea in Van Vliet's ear. He mentioned rather a strange anomaly in comparing various social experiments in utopian colonies, which invariably had failed, with Mormonism, which despite everything had thrived. The answer, he said, was that others didn't have the gospel as it existed in its purity. With the people in a confident and happy mood, they couldn't hear too often of their superiority over the Gentiles or of being persecuted for righteousness' sake. There's some tongue-in-cheek humor a little bit for Samuel Taylor. Taylor asked, "What was your object in coming here? Was it to rebel against the general government?" So he's asking the congregation these rhetorical questions, right? "Did you come out here to rebel against the government?" From behind him, Brigham Young supplied the answer: "To get away from Christians."
That's awesome. Yeah, Brigham's not too concerned with the use of that label like we are today.
No. Samuel Taylor relates, "The Bowery exploded in laughter. Brother Young," and John Taylor says, "Brother Young says it was to get away from Christians, from the unbounded charity which you had experienced from amongst them." And so I think the rest of this is pretty much a quote. "We came here because we cannot help it, and now we have got an idea to stay here because we can help it. This is about the feeling. Why do this people feel so comfortable when an army is approaching? Are you not afraid of being killed? No, not a great deal, because you have got a principle within you that cannot be conquered in time nor in eternity. You possess the principles of eternal life in your bosoms that cannot be subdued. The saints have been driven out before and might be again, but they have never been conquered. Talk to us of bowing to the Gentile yoke? Nonsense. What would be your feeling if the United States wanted to have the honor of driving us from our homes and bringing us subject to their depraved standard of moral and religious truth? Would you, if necessary, brethren, put the torch to your buildings and lay them in ashes and wander homeless into the mountains?" Brigham Young spoke up behind him and says, "Try the vote."
Nice.
Taylor asks, Are you that are willing to set fire to your property and lay it in ashes rather than submit to their military rule and oppression, manifest it by raising your hands?" A forest of hands shot up. Taylor turned to look to Captain Van Vliet. The officer sat with military erectness, his face passive. Taylor says, "I know what your feelings are. We have been persecuted and robbed long enough, and in the name of Israel's God, we will be free." And Brigham Young says behind him, "I say amen to that all the time." I love the Journal of Discourses because they have kind of funny little.
Yeah.
Have you ever read those where you have in parenthetical statements behind where you have what the brethren are saying? Funny. Anyway, so that's the scenario that John W. Taylor is born into. That's the world that he's born into. And honestly, it blew my mind because there's very strong parallels you can't make up with a life of Christ right there.
Yeah.
And I'll explain this a little bit. You have Herod's army or Johnston's army coming in to destroy the
Right.
Hebrew, the Latter-day Saints. You have a small city south of Jerusalem or Salt Lake
Right.
where a prophet of God is born in a manger or chicken coop.
Right. Yeah. No, there's some really striking parallels there for sure.
I had never realized that until I did this dive on John W. Taylor. But I mean, the stance, what I heard from my parents in the church, was every prophet of God is a type or a shadow of Jesus Christ in some way, form, or fashion. That there's something that reflects on the mission of Jesus Christ or the life of Jesus Christ. And that's a big one, or just like that's like bluntly on the nose when
Right. Oh, yeah.
when it's brought out, you know. And we're talking about someone who was sustained as a prophet, seer, and revelator, but not only did this prophet, or apostle actually prophesy and actually, prophesy correctly. He had that reputation. But now you have this very stunning parallel that's in his life from the beginning that marks him
Right.
almost. That those are things outside of his own personal control, but it's there, boom, right there. That's how he was born, in that situation.
Yeah. His very introduction into the world is in the middle of trying to preserve the ability to
Mm.
live the gospel in its fullness. And I think
Well,
that's a thread we'll see over and over again.
and you also see the other element, which is his willingness to sacrifice his own reputation and
Mm.
give his life's work, sacrificing his church membership so that the principle that will exalt the rest of us will go forward.
Right.
Does that
Cool.
not sound like the atonement?
Absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely.
all right, we're gonna get to some fun stuff now. Okay, so about 1867, he's 9 years old. Um, his son Samuel Woolley Taylor writes in his book Family Kingdom. I'm going to quote a lot from this because it's one of the best sources that we have.
Okay.
Although it is a bit novelized, and Samuel W. Taylor was kind of a Jack Mormon, and so there's some tone that reflects that. I can deal with that. I think it's pretty funny most of the time. Anyways, he recalls that father showed a, a peculiar self-centeredness and reliance on whim at an early age. When a boy of 9, he cut himself a willow pole, tied a hook on a string, and went fishing in the canyon. That afternoon, he met an Indian on the creek and quickly made friends. Come supper time, the Indian showed him how to cook fish without a skillet. The boy was fascinated. As it began getting dark, father said reluctantly, "Well, I guess I better be getting for home." And the Indian indicated the great outdoors with a wide sweep of the arm and said, "This is home." Say, the boy felt, that was certainly a fine way to be. Independent, no chores, no responsibilities, no washing behind the ears for every meal. It sure would be fine to be an Indian for a while.
Yeah.
And so he stayed out that night and the next 2 weeks with this Indian
Oh, jeez.
out there by the creek or wherever they were.
So does like mom and dad send a search party or something?
Yeah, they don't find him. Obviously, but after 2 weeks of spending time with this Indian that he calls rain in the face, um, after the novelty of this fun time wore off, he began, thinking maybe I should get home, and his mom nearly fainted when he came to the door, and there had been search parties.
Jeez.
um,
Dude, can you imagine that walking through the door, your mom's all freaked out, and you're like, it's cool. I've been hanging with rain in the face. It's all good.
and it's super funny when I read the Family Kingdom because in his adulthood he kind of capitalizes off that with his own children, and he'd make up these adventure stories, like bedtime stories for his
Right.
kids. And Rain in the Face was a consistent recurring character
Sure.
in bedtime stories. So it was a pretty, yeah, it was an experience that stuck with him for sure.
Well, and it paints a different picture of don't get me wrong, the Saints did have their problem with certain bands of Indians, but it seems this one was not for whatever reason. And I feel like that's something that doesn't get enough run is how well those early pioneers did get along with some of the indigenous peoples that were already there.
It's funny that you mentioned that there were some troubles because the funny thing is, it's very funny. Because I think it's even down to the year. That same year, there was an Indian war going on. It was the Black Hawk War in
Hmm.
in San Pete County, and I don't know if that extended up. I think it might have extended up partially into Cache County, Cache Valley, a little bit, but it definitely was going on down in San Pete Valley. But so interesting, right? Anyway, so in the 1870s, as a young teenager, there was an experience that John W. Taylor had where a woman spoke in tongues in the meeting, and it was interpreted that he would end up being an apostle. And he apparently took that pretty seriously. And apparently, he wasn't very disposed towards study or reading. Um, but he made it a point to memorize enough scripture enough that by the time he was sent on his mission, he had about 400 passages or verses memorized.
Okay.
And and to contrast that with his father, I was going to say earlier when we were going over John Taylor, but I forgot to mention, was if I'm not mistaken, John Taylor, opposed to the rest of the 12 at his point in time, was the only individual who had a complete formal education.
Okay.
You contrast that with Heber C. Kimball, who was, pretty illiterate, at least with writing, and others, Joseph Smith. I have a friend who says, I like to read John Taylor out of the Journal of Discourses, but when I do, I have to have the journals in one hand and I have to have a thesaurus in the other.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you can tell by his writings, he's very well educated.
In any case, so he wasn't given too much to spending time doing that, but he took the gospel very seriously from an early age. During his childhood, he formed a lifelong friendship with a boy from his neighborhood named Matthias Cowley.
Okay. All right.
They were in the same war. They grew up in priesthood quorums together. Aaronic priesthood duties. When they were teachers or deacons, they would collect the money for fast offerings to build the Salt Lake Temple. And then they were also in the presidency of their elders forum locally. And then they both left on a mission to the southern states in 1880. So John W. would have been about 23 years old at that point. One interesting story from his mission in 1881, when he was with his companion, they were having pretty much no success knocking doors, and they were in Kentucky, and they had gone around so much that day that they pretty much felt like no one in this town is going to listen to us. We're going to walk to the next town, and it's like getting late, like it's getting dark, and John W. Taylor, who's actually the junior companion at this point, has an impression to knock on the door on a particular door, and the other companions just like, come on, let's just go. It's a long walk. It's getting dark. We got to go. Right? It's like, no, we got to knock on this door. And so they go knock on this door, and John W. Taylor says, we have a message for you from heaven, and if you will entertain us, it shall be known to you by dreams this very night that we are true servants of the Lord.
Whoa.
Um, well, first off, that got them in the door, and it got them a meal and a discussion, and then a place to sleep, so they didn't have to walk to the next town that night. And true enough to his promise, the couple got a vision that night, and were converted and joined the church.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So you see a profound insight or relationship with the Holy Ghost with this
Yeah.
young man at this point in his life already. He's 23 years old at this point, 24 maybe. And I don't know if he was released at this point, but he wrote a letter to Matthias Cowley, who was still in the mission field at this point, on March 19th, 1882. And he writes him a letter of prophecy saying, I believe I speak by the spirit of prophecy when I say, if you are faithful, you will yet become one of the 12 apostles in the church of Jesus Christ in all the world, and by the power of God and the eternal priesthood will become great in wisdom and knowledge.
Ooh, and he was right on that account as well.
He was right on that, and he wasn't, he was possibly still in the mission field, and if not barely home when he wrote that. Matthias Cowley would end up being called to the apostleship 16 years later.
You know, there has to be a sense that we've lost something as a people because we don't see that much anymore, right?
No,
And
no,
when you hear these accounts, they're certainly miraculous, but they almost, I don't want to say mundane, but they almost seem commonplace. And we don't see that anymore. And I think it's one of the things we've lost out on Mormonism, right? I think because we have maybe treated it lightly, um, we're not privy to those sorts of things anymore. But it's something that I think as Mormons we need to start striving for again.
no, we absolutely do. And we need to have faith, right? Because these things are gifts from God, and he says he's willing to give them to us. And so believe that he's willing to give them to us first off, but they can be abused too.
Yep.
And you see that struggle in early church history where I think it's part of the reason why the brethren in the church got very authoritarian is because they know they have a religion that teaches men an idea that you can have a revelation or you can have communication with God and you can have these things, but then what happens when your revelation tells you not to toe the line?
Right.
And now you're button heads with the brethren, and there's places where maybe my standpoint is that yeah, God is telling people to do things for sure that the leadership in the church have nothing to do with, and would tell you to do the opposite, and I think go with God. But in other cases, I'm fully aware that people can have spurious revelations or consuming spiritual gifts upon their lusts, and it's people in a position of leadership or mentorship to tell them, hey, you're not doing, that's not good, or this is being abused, or here's some guidelines, or whatever righteous counsel needs to be given,
Right.
and it's a place to do that. And so both extremes can be true with that, and that's what makes it hard. All right, going forward, on March 23rd to 1882, so 4 days after that letter to Matthias Cowley, the Edmunds Act gets passed.
Mm.
The Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act of 1882 is a United States federal statute which was signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur, declaring polygamy a felony in federal territories, punishable by a fine not more of $500 and by imprisonment for a term of not more than 5 years. This act not only reinforced the 1862 Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, but also made the offense of unlawful cohabitation much easier to prove than polygamy misdemeanor, and made it illegal for polygamists or cohabitants to vote, hold public office, or serve on juries in federal territories. So things are
this act that will trigger John Taylor going into hiding, correct?
pretty much, yeah. This sets the ball rolling for the whole underground and everything else. On October 19th that year, 1882, John W. Taylor marries his first wife, May Leona Rich, from Grantsville, Utah. and they moved to Cassia County, Idaho. Do you know where Cassia County, Idaho is?
Cassia County. I do.
Cassia? Cassia? The middle of nowhere, right?
It's essentially Burley,
Burley.
right? I mean, it's Burley and Paul, and yeah, that's about it.
Yeah,
That's
I was
about it.
I was curious. I had to look that up when I read that, and I was like, where is that? And I saw that the boundary was like from American Falls to Twin Falls.
Yep.
Yeah, pretty much.
And there
And
is nothing there to this day. I mean, you have Burley,
yeah,
you have another little small town, and then there ain't nothing. I traipse that area surveying so much. I've done more surveys for farmers in 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 Jerome County, Twin Falls County, and Cache County, and it is sparse. And it was sparse in my day. So you can only imagine what it was like during John W. Taylor's day.
yeah. No, did I ever tell you that my dad was raised between the ages of 12 and 18 in Jerome, Idaho?
Uh-uh. Uh-uh. But done plenty of work out there too.
Yeah. So he marries May Leona Rich, and then he's ordained an apostle on April 9th, 1884. And here's another interesting story because he gets kind of concerned. My dad's president of the church. Is this nepotism or is this inspiration?
Right.
And so he's on his way down to Salt Lake from his home in southern Idaho, and he stops overnight on the prairie, and he rolls his blankets in a thicket of bushes. And before going to sleep, he prays for a sign, and he says, asking the Lord, if it's true, that this is revelation and not just nepotism. Um, he wanted it to rain, right? So you got a Gideon thing going on here, and so he wakes up in this bush. It's pouring rain, and the ground around the bush is bone dry, but he's
And
just wet, 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 soaking in rain. And he reportedly, with he must have had a good jovial sense of humor and stuff like Heber C. Kimball, because he says, "Thank thee, Heavenly Father, thank thee for a sign." And as the rain continued, he said, "I understand, Father, you don't have to drown me."
nice. Yeah. Oh, can you imagine telling your new bride, pack your bags, baby, we're moving to Burley or Cassia County or something like that? Ugh. But yeah,
Yeah,
your
I haven't
dad
had too much
calling,
experience there. Huh?
yeah, your dad calling you as an apostle, that would be kind of a head trip, right? You would
Sure.
that would naturally raise those feelings of, is this for real or is this just the old man doing me a favor?
No, I mean, I'm very wary personally of asking for any kind of sign, generally speaking. I know that there obviously has to be a righteous context where that's okay, because Gideon did it and he was approved of the Lord, and the Lord selected him to go lead the army of the Israelites against the Midianites. And obviously, the Lord was choosing young John W. Taylor here to be one of his servants. But the faith it takes and clearly I'm not there, but it's astounding to me. And so, I hope anyone listening to this is just inspired by anything that they hear from this man. These experiencing these experiences that he's having, that he's living through, that are forming him to be the man he will become, to do the work that he's going to do.
I think this speaks to his his relationship with his God, because as you related, it doesn't sound like he's necessarily seeking after a sign like Christ talks about in the New Testament, right? He's
Right.
trying to get the will of his God. Um, and the way he talks to God, even after the sign is given, he's like, okay, enough, I don't, good enough, don't drown me. You get the feeling that there's a relationship there, right? He's got a relationship with deity, that he relies on heavily. I can only imagine that probably comes from his dad, right? Seeing
Sure.
his dad uh, do his work and then associating with men like Brigham Young, Parley Pratt, go down the list. Um, yeah, and again, I think it shows probably something we should strive after to have that kind of relationship with deity to where we look at
Nice.
God as a dad and a friend and be able to have those conversations.
That's a hard one because I do like I have a good relationship with my father and I respect him, but I also fear him in the Old Testament scriptural sense. You know, I very much respect my father in a very sober way. And we're not. Let's just say I respect him. We're very close. We are warm even, but there's something else there that I think my dad never tried to be my best friend. He is one of my best friends, but he never tried to be that dad that's the buddy buddy.
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm kind of get understand
No,
what I'm getting?
look, I'll tell you what I held to, and it's something that I remember from being a young boy. Me and my dad could always kind of verbally spar back and forth as long as I kept it within bounds, right?
Sure.
I knew there were lines you didn't cross. And as long as you kept it in that, the old man was pretty jovial with me. And he was a big dude, right? You've met me in
Sure.
person. He was 4 inches taller than I am and probably
Dang.
outweighed me by about 75 pounds.
Okay.
Raised in on the Great Lakes as a dairy farm kid, drinking whole milk. I mean, the dude was just massive. But
Sure.
we would spar back and forth. And I remember my uncle was up once, and my room was upstairs, but there was kind of like it was kind of like a loft, right? There was a room attached, but there was also a wide open area that was kind of a loft.
Hmm.
And I remember after me and my dad had kind of, poked fun at each other, I ran upstairs and my uncle goes, "Oh, you're doing your kid a disservice. Your kid needs to fear you." And I remember my dad said, "You know what? Here's the thing. If my son fears me and he's in trouble, he won't come to me.
That's true.
If he respects me, he'll still come to me when he's in trouble. So I'll take respect over fear every day of the week." And
And I would as well.
that's what I took away from that. It made such an impression. I couldn't have been much more than 9, right?
Sure.
But that stuck with me, and that's kind of how I raised my kids. I would imagine that, and to be fair, I think that's probably kind of the relationship we need to have with our Father in heaven as well, right? A feeling that we can go to him, that he's not there just to drop the hammer. He's there to help as well. And I somehow get the feeling, and I can't explain how other than this story you talked about. I think John W. Taylor has a very similar relationship with his Father in heaven, where he feels like he is empowered enough to say, you gotta give me a sign that this is correct, because I'm freaking out.
He clearly didn't feel like his prayers hit a ceiling
Right,
once he was right. Like God's hearing him. He
right.
fully believes that. And clearly God shows him that he hears him. All right, so around this time period, John Taylor receives the 1882 revelation, which tells us that men who do not live celestial plural marriage will begin to be dropped from leadership positions and to fill vacancies in Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the presidency of the 70s. They call Seymour B. Young to be a member of the presidency of the 70s. He comes into this story later. So remember Seymour B. Young. He does live plural marriage because that was one of the conditions. He was not living it when John Taylor got a revelation. Um, and I don't know if Heber J. Grant was, but he was one called in that revelation to the 12, and George Teasdale was the other one.
Okay.
All three of them are involved heavily in this time period, and all three of them have performed at least one post manifesto plural marriage.
Okay. All right. Wow. So this 1882 revelation leaves a mark on these men.
I don't know if it does or not. I'm throwing that out there as a historical footnote that I find very interesting, though. That called by revelation and Seymour B. Young, Heber J. and George Teasdale, him especially, heavy post-manifesto plural marriage um, ordinances. In any case, so that stuff's going on. In On October 18th, 1884, John Taylor is subpoenaed to court to testify because of the law, stuff that's going on. And I wanted to read some of that conversation, some of the typescript from that court. Let's see. The attorney asks, "There's a doctrine of the church, is there not, Mr. Taylor, of plural marriage?" "Why, certainly there is." "Well, now, does not the church require that when members of its faith are about to enter into a plural marriage, that such marriages should be performed in one of the endowment houses?" "No, sir." Are not plural marriages entered into by members of the church so far as you know? Are they performed in the endowment house?" "No, sir." And Mr. Dickinson says, "Where are they performed if not in the endowment house?" John Taylor says, "I cannot say." So they're trying to trip him up. They're trying to basically seize control of the endowment house and get probable cause to seize it.
Right.
Saying, if these plural marriages are going on there, we can go and take whatever is in there. And so they're trying to get him to admit that that's being done in the endowment house. And he's saying, "Nope, we're not doing it there." "Do you know of any plural marriages ever having been entered into by members of the church outside the endowment house?" "Yes." "Who?" "I could not say." "Is there any place called an endowment house, a temple, or known by any other name which is set apart as a place for the celebration of plural marriages?" "Not specifically." I do not ask you if it is set apart exclusive of other things. We understand that. I repeat the question: is there any place which is set apart as a place for the celebration of plural marriages? President Taylor says there is no specific place set apart for the celebration of marriages. Question: what temples were there prior to the time the Logan Temple was completed? Answer: there is a temple down in St. George. Question: then prior to the time when the Logan Temple was dedicated in May last, I understand you to say that there was no place set apart for the celebration of the rites of matrimony except the endowment house and the temple at St. George. Answer: I think you misunderstand me, sir. Question: well, please be kind enough to correct me. Answer: I do not wish it to be understood that any place was set apart for the purpose of matrimony, not for that exclusively. Question: now, are there no other places than those that you have mentioned where the church authorizes the rite of plural marriages to be performed? President Taylor answers: the rite of plural marriage can be performed in other places. There is no place set apart specifically for it. As I have said, there are places that are appointed for a great many ceremonies, among which is the ceremony of marriage. The ceremony of marriage can be performed outside any of these places. I'm speaking of plural marriages. Yes, sir. And so he goes on, and he's just telling them straight up that we're not doing this in the endowment house. It doesn't take an endowment house, doesn't take a temple to do these marriages. And he asks, if parties are living here in Salt Lake, members of the Mormon faith, a man and a woman who are desirous to enter into plural marriage, would they not be required to go have the ceremony performed in an endowment house? And he says it would be the authority to get married that would pass no matter where it was. Well, who gives the authority? I give that authority. In all cases? Generally in all cases. Is there any other persons authorized to grant that dispensation? There are persons I might appoint. Have you conferred upon any person that authority within the last 3 years? Yes, sir. Who? Sometimes Joseph F. Smith, sometimes George Q. Cannon. I found that interesting.
Yeah.
Do you remember any others upon whom you conferred that authority within that time? I do not remember any at present, but you are the person who confers the authority? Yes, sir. Then you do know upon whom you do confer authority. And he says there are hundreds of people who have authority.
Ooh.
In this city? Well, there are a great many in this city. Has anyone not authorized the right to celebrate the rites of matrimony? No, sir. It must be by one upon whom the authority has been conferred by you, correct? No, sir, not by me. Who confers the authority? Sometimes others. So he had so this tells you that he had not only authorized other people to take care of this business, but he had authorized other people to authorize others to take care of
Yeah.
this business.
Yeah, and what you can't draw a straight line to it, but it's to me it's um pretty a pretty strong indication that second anointings are getting passed around pretty heavily at this point.
Well, I do know for a fact that even in hiding, which hasn't happened yet at this point, he was signing recommends for those things to be taken care of. And I don't know where they were being done. Um, Inside, outside of endowment house, off, clearly it doesn't matter. And he goes on to say as much actually because they're trying to trip him up, right? To say this is done in the endowment house so that they can get in. And they also ask him, um, I think they ask him. If not, maybe it's this cross examination. He gets examined by the church attorney later during this thing, Franklin S. Richards, and he says, President Taylor, in your direct examination, you spoke of having appointed or authorized persons to celebrate plural marriages. State whether or not such authorization or appointments extend only to plural marriages, or whether the appointees had the authority to celebrate first marriages also. In other words, was the authorization general as to marriage or confined to plural marriage only? And John Taylor answers, it was general in all these matters and things performed in the house.
Hmm.
And that was an interesting thing to include at the end there. And things performed in the house, presumably meaning the endowment house, presumably meaning other things aside from the marriage itself, which I don't know more than that. That's just what the typescript says.
Right.
And so Franklin Richards asks again, you made reference, lawyers have to be clear, right? Yeah. So he asks him again, you made reference to authorization or recommendation of parties to the buildings at which these ceremonies are performed. State also whether the regulations and recommend you refer to applies equally to parties who go to celebrate marriages, first marriages, or plural marriages, or whether there is any distinction. And John Taylor says there is no distinction. So John Taylor is saying in court that there is no distinction between the authority to perform a marriage, whether it's a first marriage or a plural marriage. It's the authority to seal by the priesthood is the authority to seal by the priesthood.
Right.
And the funny thing about that is 40 years later, Heber J. Grant, when he's president of the church, says there is no man living upon the earth that has the authority to seal plural marriages.
Oh.
Which wouldn't that mean technically that if he's saying that, since John Taylor is saying that that authority is the same, that Heber J. Grant would be admitting that there's no authority to seal first marriages?
Yeah, yeah. If you're gonna hold to what Taylor said, by de facto, that's exactly what Heber J. Grant is saying.
Anyways, I hope that wasn't too long winded, but
No.
it lays the groundwork for things that we know are it fits with the context of what we know happens pretty soon after this. In any case, John Taylor's own words, I'm going to read some of that. The next day, actually, in Ogden, he gives a talk and he says, this is John Taylor, not John W. This is President John Taylor. I was lately called upon as a witness. Perhaps you may have seen some account of it in the papers, and I want to make some explanation in relation to the matters that I then presented because they are not generally understood. I was required to divulge certain things. I did not know I did not know them to divulge. Perhaps some of you have had people come to you with their confidences. I have, but I don't want to be a confidant. Why? Because if they made a confidant of me and I was called before a tribunal, I could not, as an honorable man, reveal their confidences, yet it would be said I was a transgressor of law, but no honorable man can reveal confidences that are committed to him. Therefore, I tell them to keep their own secrets and remember what is called the Mormon Creed, mind your own business. I don't want to know the secrets of people, those that I cannot tell. And I could not tell very much to that court, for I have studiously avoided knowing any more than I could possibly help about such matters.
Nice.
I was asked questions about our temple, which of course I could not divulge. I was asked questions about records, which I could not tell them because I did not know. I have studiously avoided entering into a knowledge of these matters. They did not build our temples. We have never had any revelations from God through them. We may have had them from the devil, or they may have had them from the devil, but never have the revelations of God from them. And I think there are some things we have a right to guard sacredly in our own bosoms. We are told the secret of the Lord is with them that fear him, and he will show them his covenant. Now, if the Lord shall commit a secret to me, I don't think I should tell it to anyone. I don't think I would, not unless he told me. Then I do not want to know your secrets. I was asked if certain ordinances could be performed in different places. I told them yes, under certain circumstances. Where? I was asked. Anywhere besides in temples? Yes. Anywhere besides in the endowment house? Yes. Where? In some other house? In another house? Or out of doors, as the circumstances might be. Why did I say that? Is not a temple the proper place? Yes, but it is said in our revelations pertaining to these matters, verily, verily, I say unto you, when I give a commandment to any of the sons of men to do a work unto my name, and those sons of men go with all their might and with all they have to perform that work, and cease not their diligence, and their enemies come upon them and hinder them from performing that work, behold, it behooveth me to require that work no more at the hands of those sons of men, but accepted their offerings. Thus, under such circumstances, we perceive that our operations elsewhere will be correct. It makes no difference. It is the authority of the priesthood, not the place, that validates and sanctifies the ordinance. All right. So that's that deal. Moving along in the timeline, January 1885, the pressure's mounting, and John Taylor authorizes the purchase of 100,000 acres of land in Mexico.
He's thinking they're going to have to bug out.
Yeah, he's looking for a place to bug out, and if not, to at least get the people that would be persecuted, those living the principle, into hiding out there. That was in January. On February 1st is the last day John Taylor was in public, and he goes to the tabernacle, I believe, and there is an account of this in the Journal of Discourses. It's volume 26, page 151. And this is the last discourse John Taylor ever gave publicly. Okay, and I felt that was it'll be appropriate to read. You fled from Missouri to Illinois, and then from Illinois to this land. And why? Why did you leave Illinois to come here? Did you injure anybody? No. They killed your prophets, and I saw them martyred, and was shot most unmercifully myself, under the pledge of protection from the governor. And they thought they had killed me, but I am alive yet by the grace of God. Why had you to leave? Because they murdered your prophets and wanted to possess themselves of your property. The history of these things is quite familiar to you as Latter-day Saints, and you do not think it anything strange. Some of our young people think that the present proceedings are very remarkable, but many of us, gray-headed folk, have seen plenty of such proceedings, and have had many experiences of this kind. They are nothing new to us at all. And did we ever expect them to get better? We have not so understood it. We are told in Scripture, and have kept teaching it all the while, that the wicked would grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. That is doctrine which I have believed in for the last 50 years, and I have had a good deal of testimony and practical confirmation on that point. We expect that these things will transpire. We have been told about secret organizations that should exist, and they are beginning to permeate these United States and are laying the foundation for disruption, disintegration, and destruction. The whole nation today is standing on a volcano, but they do not seem to comprehend it. Well, are we surprised? I am not. It is strictly in accordance with my faith. It is strictly in accordance with the Old Testament scriptures, and it is strictly in accordance with the Book of Mormon. It is strictly in accordance with the revelations given to us by Joseph Smith. And all these events that have been predicted will most assuredly transpire. But I suppose it is necessary that judgment should first begin at the house of God. God has revealed to us certain principles pertaining to the future, which men may take objection to. He has revealed unto us certain principles pertaining to the perpetuity of man and of woman, pertaining to the sacred rights and obligations which existed from the beginning, and he has told us to obey these laws. The nation tells us, if you do, we will persecute and prescribe you. What shall we obey? I would like to obey and place myself in subjection to every law of man. What then? Am I to disobey the law of God? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now I believe they have violated that, and they have violated their oaths, those that have engaged in these things and passed that law, and those that are seeking to carry it out. Congress and the President of the United States and the judiciary and all administrators of the law are as much bound by that instrument as I am and as you are, and have sworn to maintain it inviolate. It is for them to settle these matters between themselves and their God. That is my faith in relation to this matter. Yet by their action they are interfering with my rights, my liberty, and my religion, and with those sacred principles that bind me to my God, to my family, to my wives, and to my children. And shall I be recreant to all those noble principles that ought to guide and govern men? No, never, no, never, no, never. I can endure more than I have done, and all that God will enable me to endure. I can die for the truth, but I cannot, as an honorable man, disobey my God at their behest, forsake my wives and my children, and trample these holy and eternal obligations underfoot that God has given me to keep, and which reach into the eternities that are to come. I won't do it, so help me God. And then he strikes a book on the desk.
Going hard.
Yeah, and that's the last. Those were some of his last words, and I believe also, and I guess I didn't have it in here. He also tells how Joseph Smith introduced the principle to him in Nauvoo, where they were out on a horse ride, I think, by the graveyard in Nauvoo, and Joseph tells him he had already revealed it to him, but John Taylor, and I don't know if the others of the 12 had started taking other wives yet, but Joseph told John Taylor specifically, you've got to do this. We've got to do this. And if you don't, the keys will be turned against us.
Ooh.
Right? So there's a very real thing here that is not talked about as much as maybe as it should. And I want to touch on it more later than I will now. But it's like if you don't use it, you lose it.
Right.
If you do not uphold these keys and use these keys, what does it even mean to be they'll be turned against you? That sounds rough.
Yeah.
Whatever that.
Yeah, that to me that sounds like that sounds like what God told Joseph Smith in the grove about the other religions, right? They draw near to me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. You can wear whatever label you want to wear, but at the end of the day, it's all about the works that you're willing to perform. And those keys will stand as a witness against you if not exercised.
Yep. And even can you exercise them legally or lawfully at a certain point if you've not
It's an interesting
magnified that commission? I don't know. But it sounds like that to a degree. And I think these things are heavily on his mind at this point as he's going into hiding and he's remembering that that these keys will be turned against us, whatever that means, if this does not go forward. In any case, so he goes into hiding on that very same day. That was February 1st. February 3rd, 2 days later, the Idaho test oath law went into effect, which basically it disenfranchised all Mormons from holding any public office or voting, regardless of being polygamist or not. You just had to be Mormon.
Right.
And if it wasn't that one, there is a law later that happens where that is the case. February 9th, 1885, the first of 350 families from Snowflake, Arizona, who are practicing polygamy move to the land bought in Mexico, which was the Casa Grande River in the state of Chihuahua. And George Teasdale, who was called by revelation in 1882 by John through John Taylor, was called to preside as the mission president and as the local top dog over the Mexican colonies for the next few years. And so he and a patriarch, the mission presidency was George Teasdale, Alexander F. McDonald, and Helaman Pratt, the son of Parley P. Pratt. And every single one of those three men end up being post-manifesto polygamists or helping others enter into polygamy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Alexander F. McDonald ends up becoming patriarch in that area once it goes from being a mission district into a stake. Now, going back to John W. Taylor, he publishes an article in the Deseret News while his father is in hiding. Comes out on April 6th, 1885. And he says, the principle of plural marriage, against which the main force of the opposition is being hurled, has been a divine institution from before the foundation of the world. There has been some talk about President Taylor issuing a revelation abolishing that system of marriage. When a revelation of that kind is given, it will be when the Lord has no use for the Latter-day Saints, and this will never transpire, for he has promised to give them the kingdom and to sustain them. So he's laying it all out there. That's how he feels about it.
Let me stop and ask this question here real quick. Is there any sort of record about what's happening personally between John Taylor and his son John W. Taylor at this point?
There was one story I was going to tell. Actually, thanks for bringing it up. So John Taylor was being shuffled around, house to house, hiding place to hiding place. And it was a really risky move. Perhaps it was thought, well, if you're in plain sight, they're not going to, they're not going to look in plain sight. So they decided to have him at the Gardo house, which was where the president of the church lived. Mm-hmm. So it's like, and it wasn't like it was a regular thing, but one night he went back home, right? So they're not going to look here, right? The one day, we're just going to be here for one night. He's been gone for so long. They're never. Guess who comes knocking through the door?
The federal government.
The federal government. Yeah, on the one night that he's there. Well, John W. Taylor's also in the house at the time, and the guards get John Taylor into some room in the upstairs, and I don't recall if it was a closet or some other. I think it was they just hide him in a closet, bedroom closet, and they're searching the house, and the worst thing that can possibly happen. It was either a sneeze or a coughing fit or something like that. And John Taylor sneezes out loud or it goes into a coughing fit, whatever. Literally, draws the attention. And guards rush upstairs. And one of the wives is able to intercept them. And they're like, move aside and all that. And she's able to pin it on John W. Taylor and say, I don't know if it was his mom or who it was, but, young John W. Taylor's here and he's sick. He has a cold. And, and so they go and get him. And sure enough, he was under the weather, looked like it. And he was able to put up a good front. Good front there to save his dad's butt.
Boy, sure puts a new twist on calling in sick, doesn't it?
Yeah, things could have ended up very differently had that happened right there. It's not, that was before 1886, if you catch my drift. So if I recall, so that could have been bad.
Keys. Oh yeah, all the keys at that point rested with the 12 and the first presidency. So if one of them's caught, it's a major blow.
Yeah. And John Taylor he was a prophet. He was getting thus saith the Lord revelations. And he's like like his son that we're discussing, he was able to get the word of the Lord. And we start to see after these two men kind of go away that that seems to happen less and less over time.
Right.
And so that would have been a very bad thing. But interesting, around this time, um, around September 28th, there's a discussion of what kind of concessions can we start to make between George Q. Cannon and a guy named George Miller, who was a doctor. And I don't think he gets very far, but it's just like talk, right? Like what's going on? What kind of deals would we have to make? What would we have to say to get this stuff to stop? And that kind of leads into the Lauren Woolley story a little bit, because this is the time frame that we're talking about where talk of compromise was present at, and significant to this time also, and there are interesting witnesses connected to this. In November of 1885, we're not quite in 1886 yet, but 1885 November, Joseph Smith III was in the state of Utah on a mission for the RLDS Church.
Right.
And at the same time that the government's persecuting the church for polygamy, they're preaching against polygamy and denying that it was ever taught by Joseph Smith. And so they're on a mission to rescue sheep from the fold,
Right.
And let's see. Anyway, that'll play in a minute. On November 16th, 1885, George Q. Cannon writes, in the evening, President Taylor told me that he had some very pleasant manifestations this morning regarding himself and myself and the work in general. The Lord had signified to him that his sins were forgiven him and that his labors were accepted of him, and that he would have a place prepared for him as he had for Joseph, and that he should dwell with him. Also that my labors were acceptable to the Lord, and that he was pleased with me as my course was satisfactory to him. And he heard our prayers that he had heard our prayers and he would answer them, and that he had given his angels charge concerning us, and they were watching over us, and no hand should prevail against his work, for it should roll forth. And so there is a reminiscence from Mariner W. Merrill, who's an apostle, at this time, that while Joseph Smith III was in Utah, John Taylor had a visitation from Joseph Smith and talked about that.
A visitation from Joseph Smith III?
No, the prophet.
Oh, okay.
His resurrected body, by the way. Sorry. And they had a conversation regarding the course of Joseph III, and Joseph Smith Jr. remarked to President Taylor his sorrow for seeing his son's actions, but promised John Taylor that the raid would cease soon. And so that's an interesting prelude to
the Woolley story.
Yeah. And so we see interesting things happening. According to D. Michael Quinn, in December, so the next month, after this revelation, and I'm not sure, it looks like that could have been this visitation. So this would have happened in November of 1885. December of 1885, it sounds like Christ also visits John Taylor. D. Michael Quinn, in a conference talk he gave to the All Red Group in 1991, says, there is no question that, again, the historical evidence in terms of what I am bound by, the historical evidence in terms of what I am bound by in my training as a historian, there is no question historically to cast any doubt on the 1886 revelation. There can also be no question that John Taylor spoke with God face to face in 1885 and also in 1886. I'll refer you to that. In December 1885, Joseph Smith III, well, actually from November to December, Joseph Smith III of the Reorganized Church was going throughout Utah preaching that plural marriage was not a practice of his father, and that it was only a corrupt, evil intention of Brigham Young. During that time, John Taylor received a revelation in December wherein Jesus Christ appeared to him face to face.
Hmm.
That revelation and that appearance of Christ to John Taylor was being referred to in people's diaries.
Can't get enough of the Mormon Renegade podcast? Well, good news. We're on Patreon, and there's 3 packages that you can choose from. The first one, the Slightly Rowdy package, allows you to hear the podcast without all those pesky commercials getting in the way. For those who want a slightly more in-depth experience, there's the Stirring It Up package, where you can hear ad-free audio, ad-free video, and transcripts. Finally, for those who want to go full Renegade, that package is available too, where you can get everything in the previous 2 packages, plus an extra show where myself and Ben Winfield break down the news of the day from a very Mormon point of view. You will also get exclusive access to Renegade Chat, and on there you'll be able to talk to others about the show or whatever topics are on your mind. Go to Patreon today and get your exclusive content.
In meetings of local wards as early as May of 1886. So this is months before the September 1886 events that you have people publicly saying and recording in their diaries that John Taylor had received a revelation concerning plural marriage and had spoken with Christ face to face. So in the July or May 1886 journal account he's talking about, one of them was from a guy named Philo Dibble, who I believe lived at the same time as Joseph Smith as well. He was an old timer.
Right.
He writes in his journal that he went to the high priest's quorum meeting, it was actually someone else's journal. It was John Moon Clements, I want to say, writing that Philo Dibble came to the high priest meeting saying that he had heard that John Taylor had seen Joseph Smith in his resurrected body.
Wow.
Yeah. So these things are going on not once, but as a series of events.
Kind of propping up Taylor throughout these persecutions here.
Uh-huh. And if you needed a second comforter, I mean, that's what it's called, right? The comforter. You know, that's right. When you need. So January 1886, John Taylor receives a letter while he's hiding on the underground at the Carlisle residence. Someone writes to him, "Dear brother, I write you in kindly and brotherly love. You are hidden away and cannot know the true feelings of our people, and those that surround you are afraid to tell you if they know. There is a general murmur, a feeling of uncertainty that has not been manifested since the days of Nauvoo. The people say that you and Cannon and Smith have run away and left the masses to go to the penitentiary or humiliate themselves before the courts as they may. And if they take the latter course, you ostracize them like you have Sharp, which is obviously the last name of some guy. You will force men to go to the pen when you will not go yourselves. The murmurings go so far as to say, if Brother Brigham were with us, it would be otherwise, and wish for a man that could lead us out of the darkness. Why does not someone come to the front and save our people from division? If these things continue in this way much longer, there will be more danger within than without the church. Something should be done. By your course, you are not uniting the people. You are setting one apart, the polygamists who want to obey the laws of the land against those who will not obey them. But hide or go into court and swear falsely. You will do nothing for us. How in the name of God can you still claim to be a leader when you have ceased to be a leader, but instead become a divider? Why do you not do something for the people? What hope have you? You proclaim to the world that there are 2% polygamists and 98% monogamists. Now, with half of those in polygamy going back on it and the other half hiding away, what do you expect to accomplish? In a word, why do you not advise the people to obey the law of the land you live in and get an enabling act passed by Congress and get Utah admitted as a state? In this way, put a stop to all the wrangling and let peace come to so many unhappy families. You are hardly aware of the many polygamists that sneak to the governor and through him get a pardon from the president to go about their homes as usual. Many saints that have been in the church since the beginning say that your administration consists of nothing except contrariness. You are notorious for ignoring the people's will. I do not want you to come out and go the pen, but what I and all the people do want is for you to do something. Save us from division and contention within and reproach from without. We appeal to the highest tribunal as a last resort, but this did no good. Now what can we do? Take it to the Lord, and from his silence he plainly says, I have heard the cries of the daughters of Zion. I have counted the broken hearts of the many women who have been sent to their graves on account of polygamy, and I will withdraw for a season until my people shall repent. If you do not want to take the responsibility of doing away with polygamy upon yourself, you can do this. Order an election of all the people and let them say yes or no without fear or hindrance, and you will see for yourself how they feel, and you will be exonerated from all blame. Or, if you do not want to do that, why do you not go to Mexico and take all those that want to still continue the practice, and there is peace, and the 98% can obey the law, and I will promise a greater adherence to the church than you can now conceive of.
Ooh, so John Taylor is getting pushback from the general membership now.
Yeah, hardcore pushback. Like, it's a give up now. We're done. The pressure was so bad at this point. We have no idea. This was never talked about when I was a kid growing up in the church. But this was such a pivotal moment in church history. Like, realistically, like it was probably never harder truly for the saints than at this point. And it was a test, I think, and the majority of them, in my opinion, didn't pass. And it's tough, but it just blows my mind how this. We talk about the Kirtland persecution, we talk about the Missouri persecution, we talk about Joseph Smith's personal persecution as a young boy growing up into adulthood, and this never got talked about.
Right. Well, and I can understand why. Look, let's just call a spade a spade.
Polygamy.
It's not a flattering picture of a lot of Latter-day Saints, right? Where they're willing to say, let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this divinely appointed practice and these principles, and let's just step up and join the union. And it flies in the face of that 1882 revelation, as well as the 86 revelation, where the Lord says, just hold fast. I got this. In my own time, I have this. And I get it, right? I don't want to be too hard on him. I would like to think that I would have stood for the right side of things, but it's a little different picture when it's your butt getting hauled off to prison.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I think this, I agree with you. I think it's a watershed moment for the church because, and Mormons in general, because I think it showed that with enough pressure, the institution is willing to play ball with the government.
Yeah. Yeah.
And from there, it's just, look, I apologize, but damn it, it's the truth. It's the way I see it. From that moment, we have seen a dilution in revelation, direct revelation, a thus saith the Lord revelation to the church. You can look at Joseph F. Smith's experience, but that's more of a vision for him that we can draw edification from.
Sure.
There's not been a thus saith the Lord revelation. Some of those spiritual experiences and spiritual power that we hear about out of history, that becomes diluted right after that. Those things begin to go away. And it took me a long time to get to this point. I shouldn't say a long time, a couple years. I've often said there's stages to becoming a Mormon fundamentalist. And one of those stages is to go into hating Woodward Wilford tremendously, right? But I think the major part of the blame lies at the feet of most Mormons during that time. They were begging for this to be rescinded.
They were, and it's absolutely heartbreaking to me to read that from a member who apparently recalls the stuff that they went through in Nauvoo and is writing something like that to John Taylor. I mean, we discussed what John Taylor already personally went through,
Right.
you know, from that trek down to Far West, the Missouri Mormon War, everything, getting, and we neglected to mention the fact that he was shot, in Carthage jail too. This this guy is not going to back down really, but I can imagine he's getting to the point personally where his heart's breaking truly, and they're asking him now, point blank, ask the Lord to rescind this. And we know what happens is he does ask the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what the answer is. And we're going to talk so much about the 1886 revelation right now. But hold that thought. Can you mark down to take a pause right here? Maybe do some editing.
Yeah.
I think my wife was knocking.
All right, we're back. So we'll talk more about the 1886 revelation, as you said.
Yeah, getting to around that point in time, but on John W. Taylor's side of things, he starts. His first wife was from Grantsville. His next two wives also are originally from Grantsville, Utah. Do you know where that is?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, out by Tooele.
Yep.
And so he starts courting, or trying to court, or just hanging around, really. Samuel Woolley's family.
Okay.
Samuel Woolley is brother to John W. Woolley. And around this time, John W. Taylor had been chosen to go to Washington, D.C. to protest the Edmunds Law with John T. Kane and John Q. Cannon. And after returning from Washington, they went to Grantsville, and he went to go tell Samuel Woolley about this. Samuel Woolley Taylor, who is how he would be Samuel Woolley's grandson, writes in his book Family Kingdom that he told him regarding their interview with President Cleveland, and President Cleveland pointed out that the Edmunds Act must be enforced along with all law, but promised to see that it would be impartially administered. John W. Taylor said, "I was never brushed off with such cordial tact in my life. It was almost a pleasure." uh, But we shouldn't blame the president, Brother Woolley. He is merely a representative of public opinion, and public opinion is against us. For that, we have no one to blame but ourselves. Time and time again, I've told the people that until I suppose they're getting sick of hearing me, all of our troubles come from mixing with the outside world. I've heard you say that many times, Brother Taylor, Samuel said, but I don't believe I quite understand. John W. says, our people want to have their cake and eat it too. We were persecuted before the principle of polygamy was given to the people, and for the same reason we're having troubles now. Because we insist on competing for wealth and political advantage with the Gentiles. If we kept to ourselves and minded our own affairs strictly, nobody would care how many wives we had. Driving home with his daughter that evening, Samuel says he's right in what he says, but I'm sure the brethren don't agree with him on it. See,
well, and I think here we can see another departure from what Joseph and Brigham really had in mind, which was an independent society. And they're 100% correct that, look, if you want to be like everyone else, you better prepare to have everybody else's problems as well.
That's a good point.
And there was a definite feeling that a lot of the saints were feeling like we're sick of being weird.
Sure.
And we're ready to do something different.
So in August of 1886, John W. Taylor is arrested for inciting rebellion in Oxford, Idaho, which is over by Preston. And the Salt I laugh when I read this. The Salt Lake Tribune published this little article. It reads, "The rattle-brained son of a polygamous mother of John Taylor, vice regent of God and mouthpiece of heaven, so-called Johnny Taylor II, who, in his typically red-hot style, not only harangued the saints about sin but on two counts exhorted them to defy the law. He said, 'I want you people to go to the polls and vote, every man of you, and maintain your rights and defend them,' he declared, in direct defiance to Idaho law um, disenfranchising all Mormons on the grounds that they belong to a sect that fostered sin and lawlessness. He said, 'Send in your votes, go to the polls, carry your case to the Supreme Court of the territory and the Supreme Court of the United States. What are you? A lot of cattle fit only fit only to be governed. You are not to be controlled by a few corrupt adventurers and sycophants. Fight every inch of ground and claim your rights.' And regarding the principle, he openly defied the government. He said, 'You that are in polygamy have broken no law. I believe in polygamy. I am the son of a polygamist mother, and,' he declared from the pulpit rostrum, 'I mean to practice it too.'"
Dude, I like him. Just laying
Yeah.
down fire.
Yeah. Yeah. He got arrested, and funny enough, he, after making bail or whatever, he went on a trip to Leavenworth, Kansas, to inspect the federal penitentiary there. And he told he got an audience with the warden and said, "I might be staying here for a while. Can I see what's going on here?"
That's awesome.
I mean, it's smart on him because he made the warden laugh, and he got a tour of the place. And I mean, it was kind of serious, but kind of, joking serious, where it's like, I might end up here. I might as well try to get an advantage by making a friend here. But he ended up not going to Leavenworth.
Lucky for him. I think most of the polygamists were shipped up to Pocatello, right?
Um, some were shipped up to Michigan, what they were calling the American Siberia.
Appropriate. If you've ever seen Detroit, it makes sense.
Yeah. In any case, so that's right before September. That was August 1886. Now we're in September 1886, and we're going to talk about the 1886 revelation. That revelation was received in the home of John W. Woolley, brother of Samuel Woolley, in Centerville, Utah. And this is when John Taylor brought the question to the Lord regarding what they were able to do under these circumstances. And now that the context has been explained, I hope those that are listening understand that this is a big deal. And the normal church response is, "Oh, that's not plural marriage. He's talking about the new and everlasting covenant. Of course, the Lord would not revoke the new and everlasting covenant." No, the context of what's going on here is totally related to celestial plural marriage.
Yeah, the army's not marching in to make life tough because you happen to want to get married monogamously in a sealing ceremony.
Right.
I've heard that excuse over and over, and quite frankly, it's revisionist history. I can't even call it
It's not even
crappy history.
it's not even that. It's like the worst apologetic or cop out ever because yeah, why okay, you're saying of course the Lord wouldn't revoke the new and everlasting covenant. Well, I would ask back, why would a prophet of God ever ask the Lord to revoke the new and everlasting covenant in
Right.
general?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah,
He
no.
wouldn't.
And here's the other thing. If you're at all a student of history and you go back and you look, every time they talk about the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, in that time frame, it was specifically regarding plural marriage. It's not until plural marriage is done away with in the LDS church that term gets reused, so to speak.
Yeah. No,
Rebranded.
when I'm going to explain it to my kids, I will tell them every covenant you make with the priesthood is a new and an everlasting covenant.
Right.
But the fullness of the everlasting covenant comprehends all of that, including celestial plural marriage, which is a capstone principle of it.
Yep.
And so those things become synonymous. In any case, John Taylor asked the question. He's at the house of home of John Woolley. George Buchanan and others are there, and this is what is received. My son John, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant, and how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. And how can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I, the Lord, am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated nor done away with, but they stand forever. Have I not given my word in great plainness on the subject? Yet have not great numbers of my people been negligent in the observance of my law and the keeping of my commandments, and yet have I borne with them these many years, and this because of their weakness, because of the perilous times, and furthermore, it is more pleasing to me that men should use their free agency in regard to these matters. Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And have I not commanded men that if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, that they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting. And those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Even so. Amen. And that revelation was coupled with the visitation of Joseph Smith and Jesus Christ.
Right.
Right. So
the 8-hour meeting.
Yeah, well, before that even,
Yep.
during that conversation during the night, and I'll just skip ahead and say it now. There is the earliest account we know of, which is, I don't know how to classify this. I think it would be firsthand late, not secondhand, but it's firsthand late, from a cousin of Lauren Woolley named George Woolley, who wrote in 19, I don't know what year it was now. It'll come down later in my notes. He wrote at one point that Lauren C. Woolley wrote him a letter in 1891 discussing that visitation had happened and him having the guarding the door, that experience and all that. But it did not have a mention of the ordinations in that account.
Okay.
But he was mentioning the other pertinent things, right? Which fits with the other testimonies we have from John Moon Clements and Mariner Merrill, that Joseph Smith and Jesus Christ were appearing to John Taylor from time to time. So first thing I want to touch on right there is at the beginning of that revelation, it says, my son John, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant. In D&C 132, the Lord tells Joseph Smith, therefore, prepare thy heart to receive and obey the instructions which I am about to give unto you. For all those who have this law revealed unto them must obey the same. For behold, I reveal unto you a new and an everlasting covenant. And if you abide not that covenant, ye are damned. For no one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory. So that's the first thing that comes to mind when the Lord is saying to John Taylor, so far as you have asked concerning the new and everlasting covenant. That's what the Lord had to say about it the first time.
Right.
Okay. The second thing I'd like to point out, let's see. When people bring up that celestial marriage is just like, it's not necessarily plural. This is kind of something that I want to bring up. This is a letter that Joseph F. Smith wrote to Samuel F. Atwood, March 17th, 1883. He says, "When I entered into celestial marriage with my first wife, I solemnly covenanted and agreed, and so did my wife, to observe and keep, not a part, but all the laws, rites, etc., appertaining unto the new and everlasting covenant of matrimony. I understood, and still do, that the eternity of the marriage covenant includes a plurality of wives." So
Mm,
that goes back to consistently defining the eternity of the marriage covenant, or the new and everlasting covenant, to not be just a priesthood sealing to one wife, but that is understood by the Lord, by John Taylor and contemporaries, to be a plurality of wives, and that when you enter into your first marriage, you're covenanting to live more.
yep, absolutely. And that's been my contention for a little while, is that for folks going through the LDS temple, they haven't been coached up about what it is they're taking upon themselves.
Oh no. Well, what other ordinance is there? Because you've already gone through your endowment. So
Right.
what, you've already been administered laws, every single time you went through a degree in the temple. And then um what other rights are there after you're married now?
Right.
So
Yeah.
get married again. That's the only answer, unless you're one of the very few lucky people ever to be called into the church to receive your second anointing.
Right.
That'd be the only exception. But
Yeah. Yep.
in any case, now we can continue to go on. According to Mormon Fundamentalist tradition, John Taylor instructed his secretary, L. John Nuttall, who we discussed earlier, to make 5 copies of the 1886 revelation to be given to men who were at that meeting, who were commissioned to make sure that plural marriage continued no matter what. Those being George Q. Cannon, Charles Wilkins, Samuel Bateman, and John and Lauren Woolley. After the death of John Taylor, Apostle John W. Taylor finds the original copy in his father's things. He was made the executor of his estate, and he made several copies in his own handwriting. And I don't know exactly how early he began showing or distributing that, but he gave, and I read somewhere, I think it was Quinn. In any case, he gave the original copy to his brother Frank Y. Taylor for a while, and he got it back. And it changes hands a few times, and we'll see where we can track that. We're going to go more into that in the second, in the next part. I don't think we'll have time for tonight, but in any case, he gets it to his brother to hold on to it, and I believe his brother, or maybe it was one of the other guys who was holding on to it, put it in a safety deposit box in a bank that they were working in to hold on to it for a while. Right after that, on the heels of that revelation, John W. Woolley marries a second wife, who is the mother of B.H. Roberts. Did you know that?
I didn't. John Woolley
So
does?
John Woolley, yep, John W. Woolley marries B.H. Roberts' mother, which makes B.H. Roberts John W. Woolley's stepson, and it makes Lauren C. Woolley and B.H. Roberts stepbrothers.
Interesting.
Yeah. Let's see. Interesting, in the First Presidency Office Journal, November 10th, 1886, it is written, this is the entry. A letter was received from Dr. John Cook of Benjamin, Utah County, asking for a copy of the revelation given through President John Taylor in October of 1886. Brother George Reynolds was requested to send him a copy. Now, I don't know of any October 1886 revelation, but September 27th is pretty damn close to
Yeah. Yeah.
1886.
Well, and that also shows that despite it not being in the Doctrine and Covenants, this was a revelation that was known to people.
It was talked about, and we're going to get into that a lot. Let's see. So, like I said, around this time, John W.'s poking around in Grantsville, and he's getting to know Samuel Woolley's daughter, Janet Maria Woolley. And he kind of shocked her by he talked to her dad first, and then I think dad broke the news. Samuel Woolley did, and then when they had a chance to talk about it, he kind of let slip. At least this is the way that Samuel Taylor tells the story. Is he let slip that I wanted to have a double wedding, and she's like, "There's another one," because he
Awesome.
so he was planning on marrying a second and third the same time, but because of the persecution, um, he was not able to do that. But Nellie Todd, who was from Grantsville but had then moved to Salt Lake, he had proposed to her already, and he marries her as his second wife. Um, Pretty close to this time period, I think in 1888.
Right.
And but let's see. But we'll get to that point in a minute. On January 24th, 1887, um, George Q. Cannon writes in his journal. Is it see how much I can skip over this. Charles Penrose tells George Q. Cannon, we seem to have arrived at a position where we are forced to take definite action in regard to statehood. If we were a state, we should only still be in the Union, but as free men with the votes wherein is power with the nation, can we achieve this without compromising any principle of our religion and still with good faith and still be in good faith to the government? I think we can. One thing appears certain: without some concession on our part to public opinion, we cannot obtain statehood. The unanimous shouts of no, no, with which the question was greeted in the House, will you ever admit Utah as a polygamous state, are echoed in the press of the country and are sounded through the nation. If the convention provided for an Escott amendment should be held, no practicer of plural marriage would take part in the election or the convention or the ratification. The provision required is that the state constitution shall forbid polygamy. Probably the provision would be bigamy, and polygamy shall be forever forbidden by law, or something to that effect. When the state was admitted, laws would have to be passed as agreed. It would not do, I think, to turn around and change the Constitution or ignore it, but laws could be enacted against bigamy and polygamy, but not against plural or celestial marriage. We do not believe in bigamy, as you have so very, very clearly established by unanswerable argument in public discourses. The same may be said in regard to polygamy. Celestial marriage is governed by divine laws and is practiced under church and not state regulations. All civilized nations enact laws in regards to civil marriages. This we must concede as their right so long as they do not intrude upon religious marriages. The Catholic Church concedes civil power in marriages, but not its right to invade the sacred character of ecclesiastical marriages, which are sacramental. We can consistently do the same. A marriage law can be enacted for the state which shall not intrude upon the marriage ordinances of the church. Anyone violating the civil marriage law would be guilty of an offense under that law, but it could be so that we could practice celestial marriage without violating it. The conditions required by law to constitute a civil marriage could be made such that we need not fulfill them in a church marriage, and thus the penalties of the law against bigamy and polygamy and not be incurred. This would not be punic faith, it would be bona fide. It would render to Caesar all things that are Caesar's, but preserve to God the things that are God's. The laws of Mexico give us precedent for this distinction. Those who vote so have a provision in the state constitution forbidding bigamy and polygamy would not vote against plural marriage under the law of God. Neither would the laws framed on the marriage question interfere with the holy principle of our faith and practice. So this is the beginning of the seed of the idea that we can pass some laws and kind of use some doublespeak in regards to plural marriage or polygamy and it being
Right.
different than plural marriage. And there's pushback on this from the leadership. If we go there, they're going to say, uh, you're using those words in ways that they aren't normally understood, you know?
Right.
And that's true.
They're
That
they've now entered the time of political gamesmanship, right?
yeah,
And it's I get it, but I'm like, no, it's not gonna. It's not going to work that way.
No, and George Q. Cannon is actually against it. Those that are for it at this point are Charles Penrose and Franklin S. Richards. And they were trying to also hold a constitutional convention around this point
Mm-hmm.
as well. So that's another thing that's going on in this context. And on March 3rd, 1887, the Edmunds Act is amended to be the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which, let's see what that does. The act disincorporated both the LDS Church and the Perpetual Emigration Fund. The act prohibited the practice of polygamy and punished it with a fine of from $500 to $800, so it raised up the cap $300, and imprisonment of up to 5 years. It dissolved the corporation of the church and it directed the confiscation by the federal government of all church properties valued over a limit of $50,000. The act was enforced by U.S. federal marshals and deputies. The act further required an anti-polygamy oath for all prospective voters, jurors, and public officials. It annulled territorial laws allowing illegitimate children to have an inheritance.
Jeez. That'll fix it.
Yeah. It required civil marriage licenses. It abrogated the common law spousal privilege, right? You need a marriage license now. And it abrogated the spousal privilege for polygamists, meaning that wives were not exempt from being forced to testify against their husbands in court.
Right.
It disenfranchised women from being able to vote. It replaced local judges with federally appointed judges, and it abolished the Office of Territorial Superintendent of District Schools, granting the Supreme Court of the Territory of Utah the right to appoint a commissioner of schools, and it called for the prohibition of the use of sectarian books and for the collection of statistics of the number of so-called Gentiles and Mormons attending and teaching in the schools. So basically outlawing the Book of Mormon and Bible in schools and forcing the public school system type education that we get now on
Right.
all of the kids in the state of Utah in order to brainwash them.
Yep. Yep. Ugh. Nastiness.
All right. So on the heels of that, June 3rd, 1887, the first Mormon settlers led by Charles Oracard arrive in the Northwest Territories of Canada and establish a settlement which is now known as Cardston. It was specifically designed to shelter people seeking asylum because they were living in polygamy. And in fact, John Taylor sent Charles Card there specifically. And his reasoning behind that was he told him, I always found justice living under the British crown.
Hmm.
Yeah, being from England, being from the English Empire or Commonwealth, whatever you want to call it, he had good experiences. And obviously America wasn't doing it at that
Right.
point. So they decided to try their luck there. And the first party of 19 adults, 16 men and 3 women, out of an original 40-member company, arrived there in Alberta. Of the 16 men, 15 were polygamists. And most of the others of the 40 could not make it because of arrests.
True.
On July 22nd, 1887, the 6th Constitutional Convention of the Utah Territory was called to head off the effects of the recently passed Edmunds-Tucker Act. The proposed state constitution contained an article that declared bigamy and polygamy being considered incompatible with a Republican form of government. Each of them is hereby forbidden and declared a misdemeanor. Another article provided that the anti-polygamy section could not be amended without the approval of Congress and the President of the United States. The new Constitution was ratified by a vote of 12,887 to 485. It was not viewed as a sincere move towards the suppression of polygamy, and thus Congress rejected the bid.
Huh.
So they didn't even get what they wanted, even by offering to make laws that read that way.
Right.
June 25th, John Taylor dies, hiding in Kaysville, Utah. And now we're stepping into the life of John W. Taylor more fully. On October 7th, 1887, he gives a talk, which I found interesting. I have a little book called Collected Discourses. This actually has nothing to do with the overall context of polygamy, but I thought it was fun. He says, "We frequently hear it said concerning the Latter-day Saints that they are led by a one-man power. It always gives me pleasure when I hear such statements, because I believe in the sayings of the prophet when he says, 'Surely the Lord God will do nothing save he shall reveal his secret unto his servants the prophets.' The people were led by a one-man power in the days of Moses. No, I will not say a one-man power. I will say they were guided by the voice of the great Jehovah, the creator of the heavens." So what do you think of that?
Well, sounds like he's really pushing hard for a one-man kind of thing, right?
No.
Read it again. I must have missed something.
We frequently hear it said concerning the Latter-day Saints that they are led by a one-man power. It always gives me pleasure when I hear such statements, because I believe in the saying of the prophet when he said, "Surely the Lord God will do nothing save he shall reveal his secrets unto his servants the prophets."
Okay.
So first we got plural instead of singular.
Yep.
And
Yep. Okay. I
the
got you.
people by a one-man power in the days of Moses. No, I will not say a one-man power. I will say they were guided by the great arm of, or the voice of the great Jehovah, the creator of the heavens. So I like the emphasis he's putting on being led by revelation.
Yep. Yep. No, I see there what he was saying. Okay.
Not by an potentially, being told what to do by one person in authority arbitrarily.
Right.
Yeah, he doesn't believe in that system.
No.
Cool stuff here. November 4th, 1887, George Q. Cannon writes in his journal that brother Joseph F. Smith, who had recently been in hiding on a mission in Hawaii, moved, and he had moved back to Utah, but he moved into the house of brother John W. Woolley in Centerville.
Joseph F. Smith does.
Yeah, moves into John Woolley's house. Don't know how long he stayed and lived there, but he stayed and lived there for a while. Around that time, January 27th, 1888, at a Davis Stake priesthood meeting, John Woolley, who was on the High Council, said, "None of us is in full fellowship unless he is keeping all of the commandments of God." D. Michael Quinn writes in one of his books that, quote, "all the commandments," unquote, was one of the codes that faithful Mormons at that point in time used for plural marriage.
Sure. And that's
obvious.
actually kind of carried down to today, right?
Sure.
That's still here.
Let's see. On May 17th, 1888, the Manti Temple is dedicated, and President Wilford Woodruff says, "We are not going to stop the practice of plural marriage until the coming of the Son of Man." So that means it's not going away, although I do find the way that's phrased to be very interesting. Like, we're going to stop it when Christ returns. Like, we're not going to stop until the coming of the Son of Man. But I know what he means, though.
Right.
I mean, essentially, we're going to practice this till the end.
Yep.
That's what he's getting at.
Which is interesting because that's what, 2 years before they signed the manifesto?
Oh, I know, dude. I know. It gets worse. But Abraham H. Cannon, who is a son of George Q. Cannon, writes in his journal um, that at that Manti Temple dedication, there was remarkable manifestations of the power of God, and various personages were seen, and halos were seen about the heads of several brethren, notably John W. Taylor.
Mm.
After that, John W. Taylor and Francis Lyman and Charles Orricar to go as a committee to Ottawa, Canada, um, essentially intending to try to get some more land for settlement and to ask basically point blank, can we live polygamy here? And they were told essentially that while Canada needed settlers, any administration that supported polygamy would be committing suicide. But after this, a confidential conversation, or after this confidential conversation, uh, the three of those guys drafted a letter which wrote or said, all the practice of plural marriage among the Latter-day Saints in the United States, so much talked about and so greatly exaggerated, has never yet induced one individual not of our faith to undertake the practice of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
Thus, it has never been a menace to the United States and will not be to the Dominion of Canada.
That's awesome. Basically saying, look, this isn't for everybody. You shouldn't expect everyone to be lining up for this.
Mm-hmm. They were essentially allowed to, however, have, like they said, we don't care if you have a wife here and you have other wives in the United States, but don't bring more than one up here.
Gotcha.
You know,
Gotcha.
and
Yeah.
you had some men, and the church will tell you this, and they'll mislead the statistics with in their apologetics by saying statistically this is the amount of plural families in Canada at this time. This shows you that it was not a polygamous colony, but it does not tell you the percentage of people in the colony that had one wife that also had other wives in the United States or Mexico at the same time.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And
Playing,
the
playing
numbers
with
go.
the numbers there a little bit.
Yeah. While up there, John W. Taylor prophesied the spot for the Cardston Temple. And after returning from that trip, it looks like he married a second wife, September 25th, in Washington State. Now, this is interesting. December 20th, 1888, Wilford Woodruff, who is still acting as president of the 12, they have not reconvened the first presidency, holds a meeting, and he asks the 12 to consider a document said to have come from Washington, D.C., but no name or names were given to it, which was addressed to the Latter-day Saints in Utah and throughout the United States, asking them to conform their lives to the laws of Congress, a document which was supposed to be signed by all church leaders when published. After having his secretary read the 1888 document twice to the quorum, President Woodruff said, "It is of the greatest importance that we decide by the Spirit what decision to make regarding the same, and make no comment on the document itself." And he asked the rest of the apostles to express themselves from youngest to eldest. George Q. Cannon, George Teasdale, and John W. Taylor were absent from the meeting, but all the other apostles rejected the document. And John Henry Smith, Francis M. Lyman, Moses Thatcher, and Joseph F. Smith said that they could not approve of such a document without the word of the Lord through Wilford Woodruff. And after this overwhelming repudiation, Wilford Woodruff said in the meeting, "Had we yielded to that document, every man of us would have been under the condemnation of God. The Lord will never give a revelation to abandon plural marriage."
Wow.
So they had a manifesto type document presented, given to them, drafted up by the government in December of 1888, and a full quorum of 9 apostles rejected it.
Wow.
Or I should say, Woodruff presented it, the other 8.
Do we know why the 3 weren't there?
I bet you George Teasdale was in Mexico, and I bet you George Q. Cannon and John Taylor were in Canada.
Okay.
John, guaranteed. Um, let's see. In September of 1889, it's still pretty hot and heated in Utah, and Wilford Woodruff basically tells George Q. Cannon, anyone practicing polygamy needs to be doing it down in Mexico. But some people were able to do it in Utah, and that actually caused some problems. For example, on September 22nd, 1889, Matthias Cowley married his second wife, which is, I would like to point out, is within a 6-month time frame that the Manifesto itself points out between June of 1889 and the last 6 months of 1889 and up to the September of 1890. Wilford Woodruff states in the Manifesto that no plural marriages had been done from June of 1889. But Matthias Cowley is marrying his second wife September 22nd, 1889, which makes Matthias Cowley the de facto makes him the first de facto breaker of the Manifesto from among the quorum of the 12 apostles.
Yep.
He was sealed to his second wife by Daniel H. Wells, the same leader of the Nauvoo Legion that we talked about in the Utah War. And in the endowment house, and at the same time, there was another plural marriage done for Hans Jesperson by Apostle Franklin D. Richards, which the discovery of which got Wilford Woodruff to tear down the endowment house to cover the tracks and appease the government that way. And he mentions that in the Manifesto itself. October 2nd, 1889, Wilford Woodruff calls a meeting of the First Presidency and Apostles to announce the policy, I believe, of these things need to be done in Mexico and not up here. And he explained that it was necessary due to the publicity of the recent arrest of Hans Jesperson, so I guess he was arrested. George Q. Cannon, sorry, hold on.
No, you're good.
Lorenzo Snow in this meeting suggests that if this was President Woodruff's new policy, that there should be a public announcement of it, but Snow's motion was opposed by Councilor Joseph F. Smith and by Francis M. Lyman and John W. Taylor. In view of that situation, then and thereafter, John W. Taylor's commentary at this meeting was prophetic. And he explains why he rejected it. John W. Taylor says, "There is something that I never expected to be discussed. This is something I have never expected to hear discussed in this light. I have understood it was policy for the brethren to take wives outside the United States. You could not publish that. You will not give your consent that plural marriages shall be consummated, and at the same time have the marriages consummated in Canada or Mexico. I think it will be best policy to let the matter rest without saying anything about it, because if plural marriages are solemnized, it will soon be known, and we will be considered insincere. I feel to have faith that the Lord will bring something about for our deliverance. If we publish anything on this matter, it will be impossible for us or the elders to fully explain to the saints, and much confusion will ensue."
Boy, he was 100% correct. He was of a mind of just not publish anything.
Just don't say a word.
Right. Which would have been a smart thing to do if you were trying to fly under the radar.
Absolutely. In the meantime, around this time, George Q. Cannon's still going up the trips to Canada, and he's telling them stuff like, "We can't talk about polygamy down in the United States, but I've come up here to see if you guys are keeping the commandments." And then, you know what I mean?
Yeah. He's like, now I know this policy, but Just wanted to see how you guys were doing. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Uh,
Let's see. Now, same stuff's going on. It's just never ending. It's like this is hard. This is the hard part for me. This this is November 24th, 1889. This is the day that Wilford Woodruff receives the revelation, right? Um, Actually, yeah. So they were having a meeting at the Gardo house where the president of the church lived, and President Woodruff, John W. Young, LeGrand Young, George Buchanan, and others were there. And George Buchanan writes in his journal that the question came up as what to do and what should be said concerning about the cessation of plural marriages. Whatever is said, I hope will be said by the word of the Lord. I want President Woodruff, if I can have my feelings gratified, and if anything is to be said on this subject in this direction, to be able to say, Thus saith the Lord. So they have a meeting, talk about this. George Buchanan leaves early for whatever reason, goes home, writes that in his journal, says, We've talked about this. I just hope
it's a thus
that
saith the Lord
I just
revelation.
hope we do say something. Like, please, will the Lord talk to us? And it happens, right? And it is thus saith the Lord. And he was not there for it. But later on, Wilford Woodruff tells other, and shows it to the quorum and everything, this is taken from Wilford Woodruff's journal later that same day that I just read from George Buchanan's journal. I attended a meeting with the lawyers at the Gardo House. They wanted me to make some concession to the court upon polygamy and other points. And I spent several hours alone and inquired of the Lord and received the following revelation. Thus saith the Lord to my servant, Wilford, I, the Lord, have heard thy prayers and thy request, and will answer thee by the voice of my spirit. Thus saith the Lord, unto my servants, the presidency of my church, who hold the keys of the kingdom of God on this earth, I, the Lord, hold the testimony of the courts in your midst, and the destiny of this nation, and all other nations on the earth in mine own hands. And all that I have revealed, and promised, and decreed concerning the generation in which you live shall come to pass, and no power shall stay my hand. Let not my servants, who are called to the presidency of my church, deny my word or my law, which concerns the salvation of the children of men. Let them pray for the Holy Spirit, and which shall be given them to guide them in their acts. Place not yourselves in jeopardy to your enemies by promise. Your enemies seek your destruction and the destruction of my people. If the saints will hearken unto my voice, and the counsel of my servants, the wicked shall not prevail. Let my servants who officiate as your counselors before the courts make their pleadings as they are moved upon by the Holy Spirit without any further pledges from the priesthood.
So the Lord tells them, don't tell them that we will stop this.
Right. Yep, 100%. By revelation, thus saith the Lord, just as George Buchanan was hoping for. And it's not like this is the first time it's come up. We had that meeting a year previous to this point in December of 1888, where it's already being discussed, and the whole quorum of the 12 shot it down.
Well, and here's the other thing, right? I look at this, you still have government lawyers wanting to have a chat with the church's attorneys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it feels, I have nothing to back this up, just the feel. If the government's sending out attorneys to talk about this, the government's wearing down. They want this to stop.
Very
And
good point.
and it feels like if they could have just held on for another year, maybe the government would have wore down. If there's one thing we can say for our government, it's not real good at following through.
Well,
Right?
honestly, I think, and I don't know. Hindsight's 2020 and all that, and but maybe not because it was a long time ago from where we're standing now. But if I had to venture a guess of what could have happened or would have happened, I imagine something similar, maybe on a bigger scale, of what happened in Short Creek in 1953 would have happened in Utah. But the backlash
Yeah.
against the federal government would have caused a severe amount of freedom afterwards. Like the government would have left them alone for a long time.
People for
afterwards.
people forget about those Short Creek raids. It wasn't the Mormons bitching about what happened in Short Creek. It was the rest of the country. This was
Right.
published in either Time or Life magazine. I can't remember which one. But you had World War II veterans saying
Mm-hmm.
things like, "Why did we fight Germany? If they can
Sure.
come in and disrupt you in your own home and you're not hurting anybody, what the hell do we fight this thing for?"
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
and I do believe, just like you do, one of two things would have happened. Either the government would have lost interest, right? They would have just said, "Okay, you know what? This is not going like we'd hoped. Leave them alone." Or like you said, a Short Creek kind of incident, which would have caused major backlash.
Yeah. And then the backing off, and more liberty. Um, so the 1889 revelation can not only be verified by looking into Wilford Woodruff's journal, but George Q. Cannon writes about it afterwards because he goes back the next day and he writes in his journal that President Woodruff shows him the revelation. And in L. John Nuttall's journal, he writes about Wilford Woodruff receiving that revelation. And then a few days later, George Q. Cannon's son, Abraham H. Cannon, writes in his journal that during our meeting, a meeting of the Quorum of the 12, right? During our meeting, a revelation was read, which President Woodruff received. Propositions have been made for the church to make some concessions to the courts in regards to this principle. Both of President Woodruff's counselors refused to advise him as to the course he should pursue, and he therefore laid the matter before the Lord. The answer came back quick and strong. The word of the Lord was for us not to yield one particle of that which he had revealed and established. He had done and would continue to care for his work and those of the saints who were faithful, and we have no fear of our enemies when we were in the line of our duty. We are promised redemption and deliverance if we will trust in God and not in the arm of flesh. We were admonished to read and study the word of God and to pray often. The whole revelation was filled with words of the greatest encouragement and comfort, and my heart was filled with joy and peace during the entire reading. It sets all doubts at rest concerning the course to pursue.
Mm.
So
So they had another revelation where the Lord said, "Stay the course."
they had a full-blown revelation and the support and acknowledgement of the 12, and it was read to the 12. It wasn't just Wilford Woodruff and George Q. Cannon who knew about it now. It was everyone, in the leadership. In any case, around this time, March 30th, 1890, in the Quorum of the 12 meeting, John W. Taylor says that he had seen the Son of God in a vision and that he had seen the prophet Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and his own father since his death. And so I found that interesting, right? I had to include that. An April conference um, of 1890, George Q. Cannon writes some commentary on a talk that John W. Taylor gave. Brother John W. Taylor's remarks were of a peculiar character. He confessed that his mind had been occupied with temporal things for a long time past, and that he did not have the spirit of his calling when he permitted himself to be engrossed in those affairs.
Right.
Brother Moses Thatcher, in his remarks, conveyed the idea that it was quite proper for men to engage in temporal things. He cited the instance of President Young's encouraging the brethren to engage in banks and ZCMI, and also quoted Abraham as having been a wealthy man, and also Solomon and David. While speaking, he said that if he was engaged in any, so he's talking about Moses Thatcher now, right? Not John W. But this is funny.
Right.
He said that if he was engaged in any business that the presidency did not approve of, he would be glad to be sent on a mission or be counseled to throw such business aside. While making these remarks, President Woodruff leaned over to me and said, "If Brother Thatcher had felt this way 3 weeks ago, it would have saved me a great many sorrowful feelings, for I have been trying to get him to do as I wanted for some time past."
That's hilarious.
Anyways, same account or different account, same conference. George Q. Cannon had written above, right, or that John W. made peculiar remarks about not having the spirit of God when focusing on temporal business stuff. That was a bit of a gloss because Abraham H. Cannon, his son, records it a bit differently.
Right.
And he says, this is Abraham Cannon writing in his journal. I went to the meeting. John W. Taylor was the first speaker. He felt that our failure to receive revelation from God is due to the fact that we are too much engaged with the affairs of this world and our efforts to accumulate wealth. And instead of trying to acquire eternal riches.
You really are starting to see a shift now, right? Where some of these guys are starting to say, if we're apostles, we should expect to be wealthy somewhat. There seems to be almost a creeping in of like prosperity gospel here a little bit.
Well, there may be some of that, but it's also understandable to a point where you need to obviously really be making enough to make ends meet for more than one family when you're trying to live a
Right.
lifestyle that has more than one family in it,
Right. No, that's a good point too.
and that's tough. But I know what you mean, and I wouldn't ever attach um, a 100% guarantee of a reward of financial or temporal prosperity if you
Right.
this way.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, Moses Thatcher isn't wrong. Certain men were blessed of the Lord to have riches. And Jacob in the Book of Mormon tells you that it's a good thing to have riches if you can not be tempted by them. And that's the problem, isn't it?
That is the problem. That is the problem. So,
That's
all
not
right.
the problem I've ever had in my life. Um, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, okay, so they're kind of having this debate too. When do we get to the point where Wilford signs that manifesto?
About to get to that. So, right after this, May 19th, this is really important. May 19th, 1890, the church tried to contest the constitutionality of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, and they shot it down. Meaning the federal government shot down the appeal of the church, challenging the constitutionality. And pretty soon after that, where is it? See how it's put. Word comes to the church leadership essentially that the government was planning to seize the temples right after that. So you have that test of the constitutionality of that act passed. The church is now officially disincorporated as a legal organization, and word comes to the church officials that the authorities are coming to seize the temples as assets. Like it is coming. Um, and we see that context brought up, at least a year later, in 1891, President Woodruff makes that statement in Cache County that the Lord showed me in vision what would happen if I didn't sign that document, right? What do you think about that?
So I don't have reason to disbelieve that Wilford maybe did receive a vision showing what would happen if he didn't sign the manifesto. And there is every reason to believe that for a time we could have lost the temples. Um, I have no reason not to believe that. However, it's not so much what Wilford said there, it's what he didn't say, right? He didn't say what would happen if they did sign it. And it makes me curious if he knew that in some way they were at a point where this needed to happen now. Just my
This,
thought.
yeah, this goes. I think you're exactly right. I think this thing goes into kind of the line of the position we're taught about allegorically with Adam and Eve, and um, this is what's going to happen if you want to stay here, and this is what's going to happen If you don't, you're going to have to partake of the fruit of that tree. But if you don't eat it, or you know how that goes. In any case, that's what's happening here. Is the Lord? I think the Lord is showing Wilford Woodruff this is what's going to happen, but it's also given to thee, right? As the Lord says, it's forbidden, and the Lord has says, don't make any concessions at all, right? We've
Right.
had say at the Lord of Revelations, but nevertheless, it is given to thee. That's what I think is happening right here. Is nevertheless, you can decide for yourself, and you can make that choice, and that won't happen.
Well, I honestly think in a moment of, I don't want to say hubris, but I think Wilford probably develops a plan that never gets fully implemented. Because as we talked about when we were talking about John W. Taylor, Joseph Musser,
Mm,
there was this feeling that, hey, keep your family records because we're going to be bringing you right back in.
sure,
And I think Taylor, not Taylor, Woodruff really thought, okay, we can play this word game here and we'll let this all blow over and then we'll just go back to the practice and we'll be really quiet about it.
sure,
And I honestly think and again, I have nothing to back this up other than what's on the lips of people around there, you know, again, pointing to stuff that happened with Musser. This idea for many years that fundamentalists shouldn't build a temple because that's, we'll be called back in and all these things, right?
sure.
I honestly think Wilford had this idea, okay, let's not lose the temples. Let's play the word game and then we'll give it a couple of years and we'll just bring all this back once the government's off our ass, right? But
Mm,
it never gets done. And
no,
so I don't I ascribe the best of intents to Wilford Woodruff, but we all know what the road to hell is paved with, right? Good intentions. And so I think this is sadly, I think this is kind of a cautionary tale of when the Lord tells you something, you might want to think about sticking with it.
yeah, I think so too. And like I said, I think it would have turned out like because Wilford Woodruff says that I saw the leading men in Israel imprisoned. I saw the temples taken, and so you see he's seeing the the Short Creek type raid on a massive scale. But I really think that there would have been deliverance, and that was probably the test of that generation, that second generation that's being raised in the
Yeah.
restored gospel. Because the first generation went through their tests.
They paid their dues.
Yeah, they did. And like you said, Wilford Woodruff had zero intention of really giving up the principle. And we're going to see that as we go through this. So we get to conference time. They've decided after all this, they get the news. Yeah, this is going down. We're going to issue this statement. And the funny thing about this is that which is not widely known, but can be proven. Wilford Woodruff did not write the manifesto.
Nope.
He wrote a draft, and then he took it to Charles Penrose and Franklin S. Richards and George Reynolds, and they took that draft and then they edited it and compiled it. And the original is in an entry in George Q. Cannon's journal that he copied into his journal, but the original was destroyed.
Mm.
But a copy of it is in George Q. Cannon's journal. I don't know if it's censored on church access type websites, but I have a published copy of excerpts of it, and it is in there. Um,
How different is it?
oh, I mean, I don't think it's necessary to go into, but it just when you compare the two things, you see that it's just this this was never intended to be a thus saith the Lord revelation. This was never a revelation from God.
Right.
And there was both of them just contained flat out lies. First off, like that Matthias Cowley thing, and Hans Jesperson. No plural marriages have been done without our knowledge in the last 18 months or whatever. Dude, two apostles just married two dudes in the endowment house.
Right.
I mean, eh. In any case, an incident in John W. Taylor's life, relatively close to the Manifesto, right before conference, he was out in Vernal, Utah, and somehow was able to have a wholesale baptism thing. And he got 146 adults, not counting children, to get into the canal and be rebaptized.
Wow.
And then makes it back to Salt Lake just in time to hear the Manifesto being given in conference.
What's his
Um,
reaction to that?
We're going to get to that. I want to read what Mariner Merrill wrote in his journal because they have a meeting of the Quorum of the 12 first before it's announced.
Okay.
And Mariner Merrill, who's an apostle, one of my favorite. After researching this topic, he is one of my favorites. I went to Salt Lake and met in council with President Woodruff, George Q. Cannon, and Joseph F. Smith, Franklin D. Richards, and Moses Thatcher, where President Woodruff had an article read he had prepared for the. I just cracked that up. An article he had prepared for the press of the country declaring to the world that we did not celebrate plural marriages now in the church, and that he counseled the members of the church not to break the law in relation to plural marriage. The article was approved of by all the brethren present, including myself, which seems the only way to retain the possession of our temples and continue the ordinance work for the living and the dead, which was considered more important than continuing the practice of plural marriage for the present.
For the present.
So he qualified that, didn't he?
Yep.
So hold on for Brother Merrill for a little bit, but we'll come back to him. Heber J. Grant, his commentary to that was, I feel that it is merely a public announcement of the course which we have already decided in our private councils to adopt. Yet I believe greater troubles will follow the prominent elders in the church through the adoption of this policy.
Ooh. I'm surprised Grant said that.
He was against it at first, very much against it. They all were. They felt completely forced into this situation. Abraham H. Cannon records what John W. Taylor said.
Okay.
He says, when I first heard of this manifesto, I felt to say, damn it. But on further thought, I felt it was not right to be so impulsive. I do not yet feel quite right about it. My father, when president of this church, sought to find a way to evade the conflict between the saints and the government on the question of plural marriage. But the Lord said it was an eternal and unchangeable law and must stand. President Woodruff lately received an encouraging revelation in regard to this principle. And now I ask myself, is the Lord a child that he thus changes? Yet I feel that the Lord giveth a law and he can also take it away. But he brought up in that meeting the 1886 revelation and the 1889 revelation of Wilford Woodruff to talk about. And so the evidence, first off, that the church denied that the 1886 revelation was ever talked about, it was talked about in that meeting on September 26th, 1890.
I can imagine that, pardon the expression, this must have felt like a kick in the nuts to John W. Taylor a little bit.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Because your dad died in hiding, holding out on this. And now in a stunning move, you're going to at least put on the face that you're not going to do this. I can only imagine the heartbreak and maybe a little bit of the sense of betrayal that he had to have felt at that moment.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in the words he uses. Is the Lord a child that he thus changes his mind?
Right.
Of course not. It's a rhetorical question. Of course he's not. And he knows the Lord is not. And so he's completely confused because not only does the Lord not act that way? But the brethren had received two revelations.
Yep.
Thus saith the Lord, do not do this, or I cannot do this. I will not suspend this. And so John W. Taylor, this is like, he was already kind of causing trouble, right? Getting arrested in Idaho by saying, I'm going to live polygamy, at a point in time where,
Right.
you know, and he will be consistently the most outspoken in public and private for the rest of his life, compared to the rest of his brethren. But he was converted to this probably before the 1886 revelation, but he was going to die on that hill after he read that. I
Yeah.
mean, when he found that in his father's belongings.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, Case in point, the manifesto, I think, was given to the church in conference on October 6th, 1890. And 4 days later, after the manifesto, he marries his third wife, Samuel Woolley's daughter, Janet Maria Woolley.
That
Um,
absolutely is the gospel version of Hold My Beer.
yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to read a little bit of what this is kind of fun, I think. This is from Family Kingdom. Uh, Certain endowments are required for a Mormon marriage. These had been taken beforehand. When the carriage reached a lonely lane in Liberty Park, the driver reined, turned in his seat, and by the authority of the priesthood, united John W. Taylor and Janet Maria Woolley in the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. There could be no record made of the ceremony. When the carriage returned, John politely said goodnight to his bride and drove away. Mother went inside and met Lottie's questioning and said nothing. Lottie was her roommate. Who was the other apostle? I remember his name, Mother said. It was Francis M. Lyman. Um, she goes home and this is right after conference, right? So her father asks her, how was conference? And so she says, just fine, father. Well, how is Lottie? She's well. We had a nice visit. I don't understand her, Samuel says. Waiting to go off and live by herself in the city. What girls don't do these days. Well, I suppose she's old enough to do what she wants. It's none of my affair. This was the official attitude of the family. Lottie had just gone to Salt Lake on a whim. No one must have actual knowledge of a plural marriage these days, so she must have been a plural wife to someone else at that
Yeah.
point. Too bad I missed conference, grandfather, or Samuel, said. He was very busy recouping the losses sustained during the years of the underground and his months in prison. Oh, yeah, he was arrested, by the way. Darn it, I was going to tell a story about him earlier. So hold on, full stop. I got to
Okay.
stop. His first wife was a niece of Brigham Young. And so he gets word one day through his wife that the brethren have told you need to take another wife.
Right.
And he's like, not right now, or maybe not ever, too
Right.
much. I'm not anyone in the church, all that kind of a thing. And I don't think she was really super for it either necessarily, but Brigham Young was. Um, and I don't know if he prayed about it. I don't recall. He probably did because, in any case, he woke up one night and had a visitor,
Uh-oh.
and the angel told him who who he was going to marry. And I don't know where she was living. I think she was probably living in Tooele, I think. And so from Grantsville, went to Tooele during state conference, found this girl, and proposed to her out of the blue.
Wow.
Out of the blue. She was also engaged to someone serving a mission at that point. Poor elder. Um, but in any case, she was shocked and kind of almost offended, and then began thinking about it and thinking, oh, maybe he'll send a letter or maybe he'll send flowers, and then he never did.
Hmm.
She couldn't get him out of her head, and then she prayed about it and got an answer, and she decided she'd marry him, and that was the mother of Janet Maria Woolley, who marries John W. Taylor.
Gotcha.
So
Interesting. Bold, man. Just show up at state conference.
Isn't that great?
That's awesome.
I'm not saying that you need a revelation of that magnitude to live the principle, but that definitely shows you some
Yeah,
providence in the hands of that family, you know.
absolutely.
Anyway, back to the account. Samuel Woolley and his daughter are talking. He asks her, anything unusual happen? No, nothing. But she felt her father should know of the marriage. He should know, but not know.
Right.
A man, a man of strict honesty, he wouldn't want to know anything if it came to a matter of testifying before a grand jury. She said, Apostle Taylor called around one evening and took me for a carriage ride through Liberty Park. Well, that could cause talk. We were chaperoned by another apostle. Oh, grandfather said.
He's not putting it together yet.
Brother Taylor is a fine man. Mother said, or Jana said, the endowment house is being torn down. Some say there will be no more plural marriages. He says, we hear so many things these days. There was now a period of comparative truce. Church officials had ceased the public preaching of the principle. As evidence of good faith, many polygamists had emerged from the underground and surrendered to the law. And she says to him, but I hear there are still a few marriages being performed quietly. I heard that a girl was married to an apostle while in the Salt Lake conference. And he says, we shouldn't listen to such tales. I don't want his name or hers. Then he asked, how do they say they were married? By another apostle during a carriage ride.
Oh, oh, that's awesome.
And, and he says to her, we won't repeat such gossip, Janet. Of course not, Father. And then he put a hand on her head. If that girl were a daughter of mine, I would give her my blessing.
Awesome.
So he knows, but doesn't know in her words at that point. And so that's the way it was at that point. That's the level it was taken to now. And people were being sent by Wilford Woodruff even after this. In fact, Byron Harvey Allred Sr., which is Reuel Allred's grandfather, was engaged to a lady before the manifesto was issued. And afterwards, he went to Wilford Woodruff and he said, go down to Mexico. And this will be taken care of by George Teasdale. Or um, actually, it was Alexander McDonald at that point. And they took care of that right then and there. And so Woodruff sending people down there. Let's see. Here's another funny story that happens around this time. Not polygamy related, just a fun John W's thing. Um, John W. Taylor kind of becomes one of the resident apostles in Canada.
Right.
And after being there for a point, and he moves his second wife up there. He moves Nellie Todd up to Canada, and he's building a house for her, and there's a drought. And so he's feeling pretty lucky because, okay, I can dry some adobe bricks and build this house. And then a bunch of the saints from the colony just come and ask him for rain. Like, you need to pray for rain. We're dying, you know. And he says, and ruin my adobes, you know. But he goes and he covers his bricks, right? And then he goes to the meeting house and he calling a meeting. And it's packed. Okay. And he gets up and he says, I don't understand it. Why are you all here? To pray for rain, they say. Do you think it'll do any good? And the people look around at one another, baffled. Well, why else would we be here, right? And he says, brothers and sisters, faith moves mountains. But from what I see here, I doubt if you have any faith. And the audience is squirming uncomfortably now, looking about for visible evidence of a lack of faith. Yeah. And he says, do you feel that you have faith that our prayers for rain will be answered? Yes. Do you believe it in your hearts? Yes. Then why is it, John asked, that not a single person in this house brought an umbrella.
That's awesome. Nice.
And of course, he prays for rain, and rain comes. So,
Something's
right on,
working.
something's working. Yeah. May 26th, 1891, that's when George E. Woolley received a letter from Lauren Woolley regarding the 1886 events. Um, so, practically right on the heels of the Manifesto, Abraham H. Cannon writes in his journal of uh, July 1891, corroborating the visitations that John Taylor had had with Joseph Smith. And he says, or he records in his journal that Apostle Mariner Merrill, right, the same person writing in his journal, we're gonna issue this article that will allow us to keep the temples because at this time we deem that more important than polygamy. He writes, or he says to the rest of the quorum, last time I saw President Taylor, he said to me, I may never see you again. And I want to tell you that I have seen the prophet Joseph, who said that the Lord did not want his people to be concerned about the raid or inquire when it would cease. I will stop it in my own time. Joseph, however, said it made him sad to see his own son traveling through the territory preaching against the church and trying to tear down what he had given his life to establish.
Mm.
Um, After the manifesto was issued, attorneys and other government officials basically ask. They have an investigation and they ask some of the leading brethren to come in, and they're going to ask them all sorts of questions like, "Do you think you're going to restore polygamy after a while, or do you think
Oh.
this again?" Or basically to judge or gauge how sincere they were. Um, and it's really hard. Basically, Wilford Woodruff was feeling compelled to make statements, and they are on record basically saying that I don't want people cohabitating with your plural wives. Stay with one. And no, we're not going to live this anymore, kind of a thing. And those are public statements. And then you'd go back to the brethren or just to the saints in general and say, any man who doesn't live with his wives is a coward. you know?
You know, we're getting into a point now to where I feel like the scripture about trying to serve two masters really comes into play. And it's completely I feel for some of those early saints in there because they're receiving such mixed messages.
They are. So they're asking in these meetings, who do we want to send to the stand to testify and all that? Brother Merrill says, heck no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to lie. He says, I'll support you guys if you want to do that, but I'm not going to do it. John W. Taylor seemed to be the exception to sustaining any form of plan having to do with this, by the way. And it says in George Q. Cannon's journal, all the brethren present, excepting Brother John W. Taylor, voted to sustain the brethren in these replies if they were put on the stand and chose to answer in that strain such inquiries. Brother John W. Taylor did not vote either for the scheme which had been prepared and which was read by Franklin S. Richards. It is necessary, according to the decision of the Supreme Court, that the master in chancery should prepare a scheme to submit, and of course, in order that he might do so, a scheme had been prepared by our attorneys. A motion was made that the scheme be sustained whenever it should be approved by the first presidency. All voted for this except Brother Taylor. These remarks were made during a discussion concerning the character of the manifesto. Brother Joseph F. Smith, in his remarks today, asserted that it was not a revelation and that he did not look upon it in that light. His view was that President Woodruff had been led by the Spirit to do as he did and sustained him in doing it, but he contended that it was not a revelation to abolish polygamy. When he uttered this expression, I said, Brother Joseph, there is none of our apostles here who consider it a revelation to abolish polygamy. We do not look upon it in that light, and there is no difference in our views. I agree with you in many of your statements concerning the character of this communication, but the difference, if any, between us consists in the meaning attached to words.
Gotcha. Yeah, so there is a consensus there amongst the quorum of the 12 that this is what we had to say in order to get the government off our back.
At that meeting, or after that meeting, the same day of the meeting, Mariner Merrill writes in his journal, so that was Cannon's account, right? Merrill records, I was called to Salt Lake City today by a telegram from President Woodruff, met with the First Presidency and 12, where a number of questions were formulated by the church attorneys relative to the manifesto and forever abandoning the practice of plural marriage, to which I could not accede to or endorse nor vote for, as I do not believe the manifesto was a revelation from God.
Ooh.
Straight up, just right there.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to know when it was the LDS Church started calling it an actual revelation.
Probably right away.
You think so?
I do, because we're seeing this double speak now, unfortunately, and unfortunately, some of these same people who are saying live with your wives, support them, love them, don't give up, you're a coward if you do, are also saying publicly anything that the government wants them to say, whatever they need to do. They are saying everything at this point that will save the temples, save the church. And I will say now that one historian, when writing upon this time, more particularly in reference to Joseph F. Smith when he was president of the church, which we haven't gotten to yet, says that Joseph F. Smith intentionally or deliberately split the church right in the middle because he had two goals that were directly opposite of each other. One was the preservation of the church, and the other was the preservation of plural marriage.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Holy cow.
So he set the church against itself because he wanted to save both. And I get it. I totally get it.
Right.
And so you tell one camp one thing, and then you tell the brethren set apart, this is what the real deal is.
Yeah.
And we have so much stinking evidence for that. It's ridiculous. Let's see. Where do we want to go? So that was in 1891. On a Quorum of the 12 meeting in April 1st, 1892, John W. Taylor brings up the 1886 revelation again, a second time or a third time at this point. And John W. Taylor says, I do not know that that thing was right, though I voted to sustain it, and I will assist to maintain it. But among my father's papers, I found a revelation given him of the Lord, and which is now in my possession, in which the Lord told him that the principle of plural marriage would never be overcome. President Taylor desired to have it suspended, but the Lord would not permit it to be done.
Wow.
So there is practically zero excuse for denying that revelation was brought up to the church leadership.
That if there's one thing we can take away from this first part of this episode, or the first part of this series here on John W. Taylor, it's that the 1886 revelation's veracity was never in doubt.
Oh my goodness. No, there's evidence. If you've ever seen the Four Hidden Revelations pamphlet that the Nielsen Nailers put out, and maybe they already puts out a copy of it too, but you got the photocopy or the lithographic copy or whatever it is of both John Taylor's handwriting and John W. Taylor's handwriting of the Revelation in both.
Right.
And so both copies have been there. In John W. Taylor's trial many years down the road, they talk about it again, and Joseph Fielding Smith admits to having seen it
and putting a copy of it in the church archives.
Yeah.
You know, it's absolutely silliness to think otherwise. And it's just so this is one lie after another. When President Grant and others said that that revelation couldn't be found, or that it was spurious or whatever it was just saving face.
It was a flat out lie at that point.
I have heard an anecdote from Fred Collier, who went to Spencer W. Kimball. That's Spencer Woolley Kimball, by the way. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. Yep.
Yeah. Spencer Woolley Kimball, president of the church, when he was a member of the president of the church, and he asked President Kimball if the 1886 revelation was true, and he told him, "Yes, it is true, but the Woolleys had no right to publish it."
Woo.
Well, he's a Woolley, you know.
Yeah.
So it's just that's crazy. That's crazy. Who else would have a right to publish it? I mean,
oh, exactly. Exactly.
You know, it could have been your job to publish it, but you didn't. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And here we're getting back into like forbidden knowledge again, right?
Mm-hmm.
One thing that Joseph, I think, really fought hard against was this idea of forbidden knowledge, right? In the time of Catholicism and these sorts of things. Rough.
So how far are we in so far?
We're almost 4 hours in.
Are we?
Do you want to go ahead and stop here? This might be a good place to stop. Because I think from here we'll start seeing Taylor start being more pronounced.
Yeah, we're getting into we're going to get into the nitty-gritty underground stuff in now. In fact, I was just going to tell you, on July 18th, 1892, is up to this point, certain people who had previous permission before the Manifesto, which was kind of a surprise, right? We're going to spring this on you right now because we've received revelations telling us not. And so people with prior promises were allowed to go to Mexico to get things done, but it gets really quiet for a while. And the next thing I see is that George Teasdale, called by revelation by John Taylor, receives a letter from George Q. Cannon, who was at John Woolley's house, authorizing him to start performing plural marriages in Mexico. And he's the resident apostle in Mexico. From that point to his release as a mission president in 1895, he performed 15 plural sealings in those 3 years.
Wow. Busy guy.
Yeah. I don't think Anthony Ivan's list starts that early, but there's a lot more that get done later. In fact, I don't now remember the statistic, but the percentage of plural marriages after 1896, when Utah gets statehood, like triples or quadruples.
Wow.
Till the second manifesto.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that doesn't tell you. I don't know what will.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No. Well, shoot. Let's go ahead and wrap it up here for tonight. And then we will dive in again and finish this bad boy off.
Yeah, let's try.
If we have to do a part 3, we can totally do that too.
No doubt. I'm cool with it.
Awesome. Well, man, good stuff, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Me too.
All right. Bye, everybody.